call and response, question and answer. That's what we're doing today. We're answering the last lot of questions we received about television, Doctor Who, TV and esoterica beyond Doctor Who, and about what's to come in the future. This is part 3 of a 3-part discussion answering all the questions we got sent in for the Q&A we set up as a milestone for hitting over 1,000 subscribers and over 100 uploads. So in part 1, we were joined by our friend Astra from Scotland, and we talked about favourites, preferences, backgrounds, spin-offs, the state of the UK, RTD2, that sort of thing. In part 2, we were joined by our friend Oliver from England, and we looked at behind-the-scenes sorts of questions, as well as TV-specific stuff, regenerations, companions, all that. This third and final time, we'll talk the most specific and in-depth questions we got, as well as future plans, nationalities and how they affect our opinions, and Doctor Who esoterica. And while we'll start as just myself, Neo from Australia, and Ingiga from England answering questions, later on in this discussion we'll be joined by our friend Nate Bumber from the USA. Like I said with the last 2 discussions, this isn't just a chronological answer in the order we got questions. No, I've split everything up and moved things around, so we're answering things in a kind of topic flow. And so part of your question might have been answered in an earlier discussion, and part of it might be getting answered here if it fits in with the topics we're talking about today more. So let's start. First up, future sort of questions, plans sorts of questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to combine these next 2 questions we get. The first is from Smithy Howard, who emailed me through the website contact thing at whocares.fun. Smithy asks, will you ever cover other shows outside of Doctor Who / its writers like you did with Watchmen, Who Cares, Succession? Before I read out the kind of partnered question to that, I love that someone shouted out the Watchmen podcasts.
Yay!
I think they're the least listened thing we've ever done, but those were fun. And we did put a lot of effort into that, I guess. Yeah, we did. So thank you, someone who's talking about our Watchmen casts in 2023. That's very gratifying, Smithy. Kind of partnered question to Smithy is from our friend Dilb, who says, my question is, what other shows, or any media really, do Neo or Gig wish they could cover that they perhaps aren't able to for whatever reason? Maybe there's a lack of interest from other hosts, or it's outside the remit of the channel, i.e. not tangentially Who related enough? So kind of similar sort of question here. Will you ever cover stuff that's not to do with Doctor Who or Doctor Who writers? Would you like to? Is there ever stuff we haven't done that we would have liked to have done, but we couldn't make work for some reason?
And well, I mean, to start with, putting Watchmen aside, we've done Look at A Christmas Carol by Stephen Knight. We did that. That's not really Doctor Who tangential at all. I would say stuff like that, when we do it, it's more just like, I mean, if the idea comes to us and we're both really interested in it, then we'll probably do it. It doesn't actually have to be connected to a showrunner of Who. Obviously that helps, but there are other things that we do sometimes. Sometimes it just takes our fancy. It's for entertainment. Like
I've said, we're doing Cracker soon. At least Tyler and I are definitely doing that show Cracker with Robbie Coltrane, that Robbie Coltrane psychologist crime show. That's got nothing to do with Doctor Who, but we're covering that soon. So there's one. Stephen Knight, I'm sure we'll cover some other Stephen Knight thing sometime because he's a writer you and I find really interesting.
Yeah. Probably not Peaky Blinders, but maybe something else.
Yeah. There's no remit, I'm totally up for doing, nothing has to be connected to Doctor Who. That's just how it tends to shake out because that's, the general shared interest between us and I guess the listeners as well. But Luther, we could have theoretically covered even if not for Ackerton and Hyde, just because he's a writer that, we find interesting. So there's no remit that it has to be connected to Doctor Who. It's just usually how it goes. There's some shows not connected to Doctor Who that I would definitely like to do at some point, one of these is connected to Doctor Who. The one I was about to say is Sapphire and Steel. But of course, not only is that a big influence on Torchwood, Peter J. Hammond wrote for Torchwood. He did some stuff for Torchwood. That we'll definitely do one day.
That's a pretty indirect connection to Doctor Who, though. The writer did 1 episode or 2 episodes for a spin-off.
There's another show I really want to cover. I'm not sure you've even ever heard of, Gig. So I don't know how this will get covered one day, but it's a show I like a lot.
Hit me.
And it's British. and it's from the 80s, the mid-80s, and I have some interesting books on it as well. So, all the ingredients are there. It's called Robin of Sherwood.
Well, okay, I can guess what that's about from the title. I don't think I've actually...
Yeah. It's about Robin Hood, but it's this really interesting show. It's really, really mystical, and it's really formalistically interesting. It's this really bizarre, surreal, mid-80s take with amazing music on Robin Hood. It's just very, very dreamy and very, very interesting.
Sounds cool.
It's something I'm super interested in, and I'd like to try and infect other people being interested in it at some point. So one day, we'll look at Robin of Sherwood. And it's also connection to Doctor Who. It's got an interesting recast in it. Interesting big recast that it handles interestingly. I think The Prisoner, I'm sure we'll do one day. Like, that's not directly connected to Doctor Who, but it's an interesting old 20th century show. Also really formalistically interesting. I feel like that will be interesting to do one day.
And doubtless a lot of people who've written for Who probably really like The Prisoner, because, it's just one of those British television things, isn't it? Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 things I don't know if we'll ever do, but I do wonder about sometimes. One is we did Watchmen. Maybe one day do we go back to Liberal Lord Lindelof and do we do another thing of his, whether it's...
Leftovers.
Or Lost. Sometimes it's not a priority at all, but I do wonder, like, someday, maybe, because he's an interesting guy and we had an interesting time covering him. So maybe one day one of those. The other thing that is a definite maybe that I think about sometimes, and I go, well, maybe not, because maybe is there were 2 shows that were an enormous influence on New Who. The kind of, you can draw on other things, like you can kind of say, well, maybe X-Files or maybe Roswell had a bit of an influence, and obviously Classic Who had an influence, but there were 2 shows that really were the kindling for RTD1, which were Buffy and Angel, and I feel like, especially now, 2023, it's a kind of interesting lens if we ever were to look back on those, because I also think as time goes on, and especially as Doctor Who's blowing up with Disney and whatnot, I think kind of the roots of it might get forgotten a little bit with how much New Who is based on Buffy and Angel in so many ways. And so maybe one day that would be interesting to kind of do a 2020s look back at those shows, particularly because I think New Who is kind of getting more and more spun away from them as, people grow up not having watched Buffy, and New Who itself is where they get all this stuff from. I saw Buffy because my sister was into it way back in the day, so that's where I was aware of Buffy and Angel. So maybe one day those. In
terms of non-Who stuff, I'm sort of wary of saying it because I don't want people going, oh hey, so when are you going to do this? When are you going to do this? But we have mulled over doing Alan Moore's showpieces, haven't we?
Oh, we will.
That was something we kind of
100%.
And the show, of course, the sequel film that he recently released. Yeah, that's really cool.
2023, we'll do that.
In terms of stuff that we sort of didn't really end up doing, I think we briefly talked about doing I Hate Susie.
Yeah.
But it sort of fell by the wayside. I really love that show. But I think that maybe there's a limit to how well we could cover it. Maybe just because in terms of its like subject matter and themes.
We're 2 men. Sometimes it can work doing it that way. I just keep putting my foot in my mouth every time I try and make a sentence to continue this conversation with.
Okay.
Yeah. I Hate Susie, I was enjoying, but sometimes there's stuff that I just don't think I could offer anything that interesting on. This is also why I kind of shy away from, sometimes Tyler pushes me and he's saying, well, you are so into Better Call Saul and The Sopranos and whatnot. Why don't you ever do anything on those or Mad Men? And I just feel like I love those, but I don't think I have anything that new to say about them, really.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like shows like that, big HBO dramas like that, they are so covered, they are so thought about. There is so much like analysis of them.
Yeah,
it's so saturated. And I think whereas the stuff we do, I think this kind of maybe slightly more niche British stuff, or like stuff like Doctor Who, or random kid shows by the showrunners of Doctor Who in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, I think there's room for more like new conversations about those. I think that we can do, and
it's just such well-trodden ground. Yeah, basically. Not that Buffy and Angel aren't, but I feel like there are some interesting ways we might be able to poke into that in these modern times and from the kind of Doctor Who angle. But we'll see. Also, like I mentioned, Bored and Bred earlier. That's a thing that is hard to tackle because like no one else will watch it besides me. But I have an idea. I have a pretty good idea, I think, for how to do that as a collaboration with many people. That should take shape eventually. But yeah, I guess those were just a few of the zero Doctor Who showrunner connection ideas we have that we'll probably do at some point. We're not going anywhere, basically. Like, we've kept this going, like, at this stage in our lives. I think it's pretty sustainable at this point. I sometimes think about when we have covered all the, extant Chibnall shows and TV films and the Moffat ones and the Russell T Davies ones, and we've, dipped our feet into some more Doctor Who stuff. It's going to feel really nice one day, just kind of feeling like nothing's on my back and I can, cover whatever I want without ever thinking, oh, but I should release that one, which we've worked on. Like, I don't know if I'll ever actually get to a stage where I feel totally unburdened and everything's done. Maybe sometime after Sherlock. But that would be an interesting time.
What if there's a new showrunner by then? We have to add in a whole new range of other shows that they've done.
We'll see. I don't think it's like an inherent part of the position. Like, there's very powerful, like, classic producers and writers I don't want to look at everything of, even if they're a bit interesting. So I won't necessarily commit to a fourth showrunner the same way if one ever eventuates, but we'll see. I do find Chibnall's kind of telos over his career interesting. That's why, like, I would like to cover all of it. Anyway, back to Voladisco via email, who says, are you thinking about doing another fun podcast special like the T2 Resolution Choose Your Adventure? Well, we answered that. Yeah. Voladisco also asks, also, are you going to start doing episodes on the RTD good stuff like Cucumber Banana or Queer as Folk? Or are you planning to do it all chronologically?
Well, we said we want to do Cucumber, right? I think you brought that up.
Everything RTD will get done. Everything.
I am curious about how approaching Banana would be structured, like with Cucumber, considering the way those two shows released intertwined with each other is kind of interesting. I think it raises challenges for how you'd sort of structure discussions about them. Like, but I mean, would Banana actually come into it, considering it's not all written by RTD? I mean, what?
It'll definitely get covered. I'm not sure how.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of other Russell stuff to cover beforehand. But everything will get covered. When I say everything, for Russell, we've done Dark Season. Soon in this year, we'll do the Dark Season sequel that RTD is taking part in at Big Finish. We'll do Century Falls. Revelations is going to be a tricky one. He's like soap because, again, I don't know if anyone's going to do that with me, but it'll get covered in some form, even if it's just by myself alone. Series 1 of Spring Hill, I'm positive some people will do with me. And Series 2, I need it somehow, one day. The Grand, I know at least one person that would do that with me. Queer as Folk will be easy. Loads of interesting people to cover that. We'll probably do more than one, maybe one of each series of that. Bob and Rose will be easy. The Second Coming will be easy. Mine or Mine are a bit trickier, but I reckon someone else will do that with me. Casanova will be easy. Wizards vs. Aliens, easy. Cucumber, Banana, Tofu, we'll both do that. We'll find some way to crack into that. Midsummer Night's Dream will get, at least us and Tyler will do that. A Very English Scandal, easy. And then we've done Years and Years and Nolly, and It's a Sin. And there's some other odds and ends I'm sure we'll cover just fine. Interestingly, enough people. I'm thinking of Damaged Goods, his Doctor Who novel from before New Who, and maybe his Rose novelisation, because I know we really like that. That would be interesting to talk about, maybe in comparison and contrast to the actual episode. For Moffat, we've recorded most of this stuff already. There's just ways I want to reformulate some things and do some other things in different ways. Joking apart, my favourite show of his obviously will get covered in a big way. His little The Office thing will probably cover in some way. Chalk, yeah. Coupling, yeah. Jekyll, yeah. Sherlock, yeah. We've done Dracula. I want to talk more about Dracula when we talk about the next question. And we've done Inside Man and Time Traveler's Wife. The Unfriend play we've done. The Curse of Fatal Death we could do one day. That would be an interesting one to do. I also think his work where he's not a showrunner, but he was writing on other shows. I'm thinking of his episode of Stay Lucky from 1990 and his 3 episodes of Murder Most Horrid. I would really like to look at those because they're interesting as well. Chibnall, Born and Bred, I have a fun idea how to do. Law and Order, the first 2 series, someone will do that with me. That'll be fine. Camelot, that'll be fine. United, I know at least one person would do that with me. The Great Train Robbery, I know at least one person. Broadchurch, I reckon 3 discussions because I think the series are pretty interesting separate units. Then I guess there's Who Shot Simon Cowell. But, Also, maybe Life on Mars one day because Matthew Graham ties into Doctor Who and, that was Chris Chibnall's first genre thing he wrote. Chris Chibnall's plays we'll also cover at some point.
Not a sentence you hear very often. Chris Chibnall's plays will be covered at some point. Like, who else is providing you this content, you know?
Yeah, all that will get covered at some point, sooner rather than later, hopefully. Chronologically, generally, yes, that is how I'd like to do it. Like, I'd like to do Century Falls, then Revelations, then whatnot. Yeah. Next question is from our friend Miraz. And Miraz asks, are there any episodes you wish you could do over, whether covering them again with a different cast or context, or wishing you could just record again?
So you said you were going to bring up Dracula in the context of this question?
Oh, yeah. I'd love to do individual ones for each Dracula episode at some point, more granular discussions, because we've got a lot of Dracula heads, you know, among us fans, among us on the channel. A lot of us are super into Dracula. I think we could cover that in a more granular way. I think we could get really interesting, digging our fangs more into Dracula, because it is a really interesting show.
Yeah, it's like 3 separate movies almost, yeah. Dracula. it feels unfair to lump them all together.
So one day we'll do that.
On my part, I kind of wish I could re-record my slightly drunken spluttering from After Timeless Children, just so I don't sound like I'm hyperventilating between every sentence. Seriously, it's so cringy for me to listen to like my big rant from that podcast. When going, it just sounds like a stuck pig. It's not good. It's not good.
We are, should I come out or not? We are actually doing something Miraz is raising there. Like, we've started it behind the scenes. There is something we are covering again. And so that's going to keep on chugging along. Yeah,
it's more a sense of what fan film creators sometimes do. They go back to their earliest stuff, which they made when they were like 7, and you know, they made with a potato camera, and they sort of go back. Okay, we're going to do series 1 reimagined.
Yeah.
we're gonna standardize it with the more recent stuff. I think something similar to that is what I'd say is what you're alluding to there.
Yeah, so that has begun. We've started doing that. And also, what I would love to do one day is more Torchwood stuff. I'd like to get more granular with some Torchwood stories because I love Torchwood. So that would be fun. Not a priority at all, but one day I'd love to do that.
I'm sure there are some like Torchwood standalones that we worth covering too, because you know, we did the box sets, the Among Us box sets of Torchwood, but we didn't really look at like the standalone individual Torchwood stories that are outside of that range.
Oh yeah, there's lots of Torchwood stuff I'd love to look at. The audios and TV episodes. Maybe when we eventually do Sapphire and Steel, we could do the Peter J. Hammond episodes, like as individual ones beforehand or something. Torchwood is always, it's one of those Sherlocky things where it's a well I know I can always go into because I love that show a lot. Miraz also says, and if it's not going to give away too much, any episode you're particularly looking forward to covering someday, whether a future one or a past one?
Well, I'm looking forward to that eventual Journey's End discussion whenever it eventuates.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. I need to do my research for that one.
It'd be cool to also to talk about Kill the Moon someday as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the Capaldi era in general is like, the Sherlock is kind of one of the whales, and the Capaldi era is like the even safer whale than Sherlock and Torchwood. I know we can do really interesting discussions on that. It's not going anywhere, so I don't feel much urgency, but at some point we'll do those. That'll be very interesting to do. I also think The Curse of Fenric one day will be lots of fun.
Totally.
And my kind of little, again, this is there's no urgency to this exactly, but I would love to, in some form, I don't know if it would necessarily be like one discussion per episode or one per, I don't know exactly how I would do it. We've technically already started it because we did the Chimes of Midnight, but I'd love to do the Eighth Doctor and Charlie run, which I know at least Oliver and I totally see in our heads is, you know, like a run of the TV show. It was like a couple of season run of a Doctor and Companion and gains with it. It's just as real as New Who and Classic Who in my mind, that McGann series. And I guess Six and Evelyn as well, but very much my heart is with those McGann audios. I would love to do them one day. The Charlie ones, to be clear, not all of them. Miraz also says, one for both main hosts, plus whoever else feels like joining in. Now that you've got a baseline of subscribers, what misinformation do you most want to spread?
I think it would be funny if people believed that Moffat got into a physical altercation with Neil Gaiman. Oh wait, that one's true, isn't it? It was in the Complete History, but I guess I'm out of ideas. Sorry.
Yeah, I would never spread misinformation. That's my answer to Miraz. Roaches from YouTube, more questions from them. They say, will there ever be a discussion on Class or the Sarah Jane Adventures?
Well, I think you've mentioned we'll look at Class one day. I think it's something you said in an earlier show, yeah?
Yeah, of course. I wanted to do the Sarah Jane Adventures with Tom Tit because he's a unique perspective on them, more enhanced than my own, but I don't know if that'll happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be sure one day. It's like, it's not a priority, but of course, one day we'll look at the Sarah Jane Adventures. I don't know, like, in what form. It won't be as granular as episode. I don't know if it'll be one overall one or like a series is broken up or something, but yeah, of course, one day, sure.
You mentioned Wizards versus Aliens earlier, and I think Sarah Jane Adventures is kind of essential paratext to that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like, you can't really do that without looking at Sarah Jane Adventures. I mean, there's a script in Wizards versus Aliens, which is literally from an unused, planned Sarah Jane script, and it's really interesting as well. So yeah, it's kind of they're kind of bound up together.
Yeah. We're not going anywhere is the thing, basically. All sorts of things will get covered eventually. Roaches also says, would the 13th Doctor work better on Class or the Sarah Jane Adventures? Considering her family-friendly, teacherly vibes, the thought of 13 and Miss Quill interacting and bantering just tickles me. And thank you for all you've done. Keep up the good work.
I imagine it doesn't tickle you very much because you're not the biggest fan of Miss Quill at all, war itself. I'm not sure about 13 family friendliness really necessarily enhancing like the spin-off shows. I feel because 11 and 10 both appeared on Sarah Jane and they didn't really need to be changed a huge deal to do that. I wouldn't say I don't think Sarah Jane is something that I don't think Sarah Jane Adventures really needs the Doctor figure turning up to be particularly more bubbly than usual. I think if anything the slight grittiness of the Doctor is sort of what introduces the tension and kind of the excitement there when he does show up, like in the TV show on those two occasions. I think the sort of the conflicts get introduced. I worry that 13 showing up, certainly if 13 was written the way she often is in the main show, if she turned up in Sarah Jane, I feel like it would almost feel a bit redundant, almost. It feels like 13's written as a sort of character who would just be in a random ep of Sarah Jane, rather than an actual full-on, like, huge mythos thing impacting into Sarah Jane. As for Class, I mean, I don't know, that just... And Class is overtly pitching itself more dark, bloody, gory, horrifying. So maybe the contrast there would make it more interesting, I'm not sure. Certainly I don't think 12's appearance in Class is anything to really write home about. It's quite kind of perfunctory, I think, to be honest. The way he shows up is just sort of make some things happen and then leave. Yeah. I don't really have many more thoughts to add on that front.
Yeah, it's like we were saying earlier that Chibnall's Doctor Who felt kind of pitched kiddishly to me. So I see what you're saying, Roaches. Yeah, there's a kind of link there. Here's an email from Lauren who says, Q&A, I've listed a few. No pressure to answer them all. Haha, really loved your show. Thank you for the time spent talking about my favourite shows. The Luther discussions were brilliant, and I loved Oliver's recent Extremis video so much. Neo, great work with all sources and clips. Imagine that must take forever. In Giga, your reactions and comments are hilarious. You make me laugh so much. Do you think RTD will delete all Timeless Child plot from story? Do you think he should? What would be the most interesting thing he could do with it?
I don't expect him to ever really touch it. I imagine he'll throw some random bone in somewhere, some line. But as I think we kind of keep coming back to whenever we talk about Timeless Child stuff, I don't think it's really as story generative as it's talked up to be. Because I think the whole premise of it is so inherently backward looking. Like, here is the secret past of the Doctor. Here are these wiped memories from when the Doctor was a baby. That even Chib himself, sort of more than once, has kind of shut down the premise of it really mattering that much to the Doctor in the present. So in the Timeless Children, the episode itself, you have Phantom Ruth talking to 13 saying, have you ever been defined by who you were before? She's like, no. And then in the Vanquishers, you have 13 putting the watch with all the memories down putting it on the shelf, basically, throwing it away. And saying, oh, maybe I'll look at it someday, but right now I'm not interested. So, in terms of how much potential it has for a future showrunner to run with it and do anything with it, I think it's limited. And I think RTD is just going to be so much more interested in moving forward and telling his own stories and his own stuff and engaging with actual ideas like the present, rather than fussing about the bloody the secret past of the Tecteun. God, I'm falling asleep just saying it, honestly. So I don't feel he needs to concern himself with trying to actively delete stuff. I think he can just ignore it, frankly.
Thanks for the kind words, Lauren. I feel like with eras, often, I think it kind of works well sometimes if a thing happens and if you're going to touch it, you don't touch it. The next guy touches it or the next person touches it. I feel like there's a kind of way the show has worked a lot of the time where something has to kind of crystallize or not be touched for a while before someone touches it again. And I guess I don't know if it's just a tradition, but it tends to work pretty well, I think. Like it's in the Colin Baker era, we start getting some lunacy with touching the 10th planet in certain ways and stuff. And I feel like, well, I'm not saying that works necessarily, but kind of the tellus of it's sort of the tellus. It kind of works in the sense that like it's been a while. You know, it doesn't feel like you're greasing your hands on the 10th planet anymore. It's like, well, the 10th planet is crystallized. It's kind of on its own. We can kind of touch it now in a way, and that kind of makes we're kind of doing our own thing with it at that point. I think a reason the Sasha Master annoyed a lot of people was like Missy got no time to crystallize. Missy had her stuff, and then immediately we had Sasha. There was like no time to kind of lock away the Master for a while. So with the Timeless Child stuff, I think if anyone's going to touch it, it's probably going to be the person after RTD or the person after them. Because if it's going to get touched, and I don't think it should be necessarily, this isn't me saying I hate the Timeless Child stuff, although, you know, I'm not saying I like it either. It's just I feel like the way, if big glory things get touched, I think it kind of works better to touch them when you're not the next person, but when you're the person after the next person, or the person after that. Even Moffat in his own era didn't really touch Classic Who stuff much until like Series 7 and then Capaldi's era. Like for a while he was just doing his own kind of thing. And I think that's how this sort of stuff should work. I don't think you should touch the stuff immediately preceding you. I think you should wait a while.
Yeah, it's good to feel like you're reviving something that was concluded before, rather than just dragging it out even when it was supposed to have immediately just finished. I think there's a difference between taking something that's lain dormant and bringing it back. And it gives you some momentum, I think, some momentum to kind of reimagine it yourself and not worry too much about where it was left necessarily.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just immediately pick it up and run with it, then it's just going to feel disjointed.
Even look at how RTD handled Rose in his own first era. Like, imagine if Rose came back in Series 3. That would be like insane. You need to miss something. Lauren goes on to say, will you ever do an episode about killing Eve? You have mentioned it a few times in the show. It would be a fascinating listen. Don't know if any writers overlap.
I've never watched Killing Eve. I hear it didn't end very well. And also Waller-Bridge, like Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who I think is kind of the main draw of it for me. I think she left partway through. So it might be one of those shows that I start watching and then just pick a strategic point to stop at. Like Luther, which I never watched any of after Series 3. I love Fleabag, though. That's a really good show. So, yeah, obviously I respect like Waller-Bridge and stuff that she does.
I think Tyler has seen Killing Eve, maybe. I think I've heard the first series is really good. Yeah, I'm not opposed at all. One day we might have a swing at that. I'll have to look into the show more. I'll have a look at it, Lauren. Lauren goes on to say, will Neo ever watch Sherlock? Would love an episode about that too. Haha. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
One day.
And then Lauren finishes with, what are you most looking forward to about the next specials and series 2023, 2024? Looking forward to your next podcast, Lauren.
What I'm most looking forward to about, I guess, RTD2 in general, obviously, more matured RTD, bringing all his experience back in. And with any luck, I would hope that it signals a return of a sense of anger or something burning that he wants to grind away at. Because I think if there's one thing from RTD1 that I would want to have maybe airlifted a bit of into Moffat's run, and into Chib's, of course, too. It's the sense that I think pervades his first era of moral and existential horror at the state of the world, and I guess the human condition, stuff like that. Not because I need the show to be dark or upsetting or anything like that, I don't. But just because I think having something big to hit makes you hit harder. And I think while Moffat Who, which I love, it has its share of great spiky moments, but he is more inclined to snark, which is inherently more passive. And I think with RTD, you can feel more of a sense of really like just raging against the dying of the light almost. And some of the like terrifying scenarios he comes up with, some of the real like rage and anger and really just damning depictions of stuff. I think there is a lot of sense of he seems to be writing for a world in crisis in some ways, which maybe Moffat isn't quite doing. I don't know, but I feel there is something really exciting about RTD's like willingness to anger and the way that he's willing to be outspoken on stuff.
Well, my answer feels a lot more slight after hearing that. I'm most looking forward to more Moffat episodes and getting the Christmas specials back. That's what I'm excited about. I really love Christmas. Speaking of things that we're looking forward to, we're now joined by our friend Nate Bumber, fairly frequent guest on Who Cares. How are you doing, Nate?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, and congratulations on this milestone.
Thank you. There's some questions specifically for you, and then there's some which would just make sense for you to be part of answering. So we'll start with one that Gig and I have already answered, which comes from a comment on YouTube by Najawin, who asks everyone, what's your favorite Doctor Who universe piece of work, favorite non-Doctor Who universe piece of work, and favorite academic paper on something completely boring that you find fascinating, pulling for you to give me something good here, Nate.
Yeah, this is... this one has kept me up at night trying to think of things. I know Najawin. I've known him for a couple years now. I'm really glad they found this channel because I've enjoyed listening or reading his comments on the videos. But, I mean, non-Doctor Who piece of work, that's like... that could be anything. So he's a real piece of work for suggesting this.
Yes, everything in history.
Yeah, I guess my favorite Doctor Who piece of work, and thankful, I've taken solace in the fact that he said favorite, not best. Okay? So my favorite Doctor Who work, I'll go with Dead Romance by Lawrence Miles. It was a Virgin New Adventure, but also kind of faction paradoxy. It was one of my first introductions to this whole wilderness corner of the universe, which I've come to treasure so much. And let's see, and then for a non-Doctor Who piece of work, I'll go with Heart of Darkness. It's just a book I read in high school, but it had a big impact on me, and I there's something about that whole plot structure that I just really love. And then for an academic paper, I'll just go with things that I'm reading right now. There's a paper called The Gospel of the Memra, Jewish Binitarianism and the Prologue to John. I really like it because it kind of presents a view from a world where there aren't such strict barriers between academic Bible studies or even New Testament and Old Testament studies and Jewish studies and patristics and like Hellenism studies. It kind of takes a view that can incorporate all of those in a way that I find really refreshing. And then a bit long, but specific to Najawin's interests, I also have to mention the book, The Logic of Natural Language, which totally vindicates once and for all classical term logic in the face of propositional calculus. And so take that, Najawin. Yeah.
That's a very interesting answer. When I answered that, I danced around it vaguely. I think Gig resisted.
I basically didn't answer it at all. Yeah, so I think you're the first person to give that a really good, proper answer.
I kind of connected to that question, I guess. 18 hours ago, I got an email from someone called Matthew who says, "Hello, love the podcast. Here's to 1,000 more subscribers. This is a question for everyone. What's your favorite novel/book?"
I mean, I guess I'll have to stick with Heart of Darkness just because that's the one I have off the top of my head.
You did answer that.
What do you guys say?
We kind of had this earlier, and I just named some authors instead of specific books.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I named a book that I liked. I think I said The French Lieutenant's Woman, but if I could amend that, I'd also say From Hell, the graphic novel, just because I fucking love that as well.
Next question is also about books. It's from an email from Lauren, who says, "What are the best non-fiction Doctor Who books similar to Space Helmet for a Cow? Looking for analysis of program and its history rather than storybooks. Have you read Space Helmet for a Cow 1 or 2? What did you think of it?"
I have not read Space Helmet for a Cow 1 or 2. Have you guys?
I haven't either.
No, I am aware of it.
Yeah, I've heard good things. I guess this is another good thing, indirectly.
Yeah, I think these sorts of books live and die by their authors, really, because we've all seen the same episodes, basically. And so the thing about Space Helmet for a Cow that interests me is Paul Kirkley, one of the writers. Lars Pearson is the other writer. And Paul Kirkley we sometimes cite on here. He was the man who did the interview with Russell about, I want to do the Nyssa Adventures in a Marvel-style universe, or I think this is what should happen, years ago, predating RTD2's announcement. So I cite that all the time, that interview. And a similar series of books is Running Through Corridors, which is Toby Hidoke and Robert Shearman. Shearman we talk about all the time on here. So I'd like to read those for his perspective. So yeah, I'm interested in this type of book in general.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting authors there. But on that kind of genre of book, there is a series that I do like and I have read a lot of. It's relevant that Nate is here and one of the writers of it has already been mentioned. I'm talking about Time by Lawrence Miles mostly and Tat Wood, mostly those two for the earlier ones at least. I like those a lot, and those are kind of, well, it's kind of like a program information book, but then it also is full of essays and thoughts from Loz and from Tat Wood, and then later on there are other authors as well, and you're not sure who wrote the specific essays, but you kind of are sure for some of them. Those are really good, and those were kind of, in many ways, kind of what Elizabeth Sandifer's TARDIS Hereditorum was riffing off, at least earlier on, the About Time series. So they're pretty seminal in a way, and they're quite interesting. I like that series. If we're talking about that sort of book, Lauren, I like that series.
Yeah, I think About Time kind of is a very defining point for the genre, but that's just in my view. Other ones that I've liked are, of course, Obverse has been putting out the Black Archive series. I haven't been able to keep up with the series, but I've really enjoyed seeing that they've paired a lot of authors whose ideas that they've paired authors with classic stories that represent the ideas or reflect the ideas that these authors are interested in their own works. And so that's something that's really compelling to me. And of course, we have some friends of the podcast who've written Black Archive. So, shout out to them, the new book on Flux.
And The Girl Who Died. Our friend Oliver, who was, of course, our guest on the part 2 of the Q&A discussion here. He wrote the Village of the Angels segment of the Black Archive Flux books, and our friend Einar wrote the Girl Who Died book because he's an expert on that sort of thing. So, yeah, friends have contributed to those.
Also from Obverse, I've really enjoyed Paul Mars's, I think it's called The Annual Years, where he just goes really deep into the Doctor Who annuals. It's a different twist since it's not focusing on the TV side of it. And also not focusing on the TV side of it is the book Downtime.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the multiple fiction books of the same name. It is really indispensable for a look at the audio and video productions of the Wilderness Years. It doesn't get as much into the books as I would like, but that's okay because we have other books for that, like Bernice Summerfield, The Inside Story. That is the one I'm hunting down right now.
I have it.
Is it good? I mean, I've seen pictures, right? So, I have friends who will send me screenshots.
A lot of it I haven't read because it's about Benny stuff, but I've read the bits that relate to Lawrence Miles in it. It's pretty interesting, yeah. And I have the Big Finish one by the great Benjamin Cook as well. That one is interesting to me. That's a good one. But that's more, there's kind of a scale, isn't there? There's purely reference books, and I've got some of those, which are just this is a guide, this came out this day, this happened then. There's those that are just entirely that. And then you have ones which are reference and analysis, which is the About Time. They have all the referencey stuff, and then they have analysis in there as well.
Yeah.
And then you have ones which are much more like just analysis mostly, which is Liz Sandifer's kind of stuff. But there's a lot of haziness between all these sorts of things. There's a lot that mix, it's not really a binary, that kind of scale. Stuff like the Ben Cook Big Finish book, it's it is referencey, but it has lots of interviews, and interviews by nature are kind of analysis in a way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of mixing and matching with this sort of book.
Speaking of interviews, I can't contribute much on the front of non-fiction books, but I do actually have a physical copy of a zine, issue 3 of Warp Vorp, I think, which I bought because it has an interview with Alan Moore in it, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's also full of really interesting other stuff and factual kind of history and some other interviews with random people about the classic era, different bits and pieces, some of the comics that were going on around circa classic era, all sorts of really curiosities and stuff. So if you're interested in the history behind the show and more obscure bits and pieces like that, zines of that kind are worth looking into as well.
Tell Us Publishing do some interesting books on the books, like the Wilderness books as well. I got the Who Adventures when that came out, I think in 2021. That's quite an interesting one. On the Virgin books, I know they're working on one on the Eighth Doctor books, which I'm quite excited for. So
yeah,
we're in a pretty good state for Who non-fiction books these days. Like the Black Archives are a big kind of surge in that sort of thing. And we're still getting lots of great stuff on like the Wilderness books. We're in a pretty good era, I think. And we still get stuff. We're getting like interesting stuff on New Who itself. A year or two ago, I got The Long Game, which covers a lot of the kind of TV landscape that led to RTD1 happening and what was kind of going on there. So we're in a pretty good era, I think, for non-fiction Who books.
And of course, the complete history.
I wonder, when will we get to stuff about Moff and Chib?
Yes, Nate's mentioning the complete history books, which are reference, but they're really, really good. I cite them all the time. Yeah, so I think we answered Lauren pretty well there. We haven't read Cow, but we've read lots of similar stuff, and we're very interested in these sorts of books. Back to Najawin, and this is a question more for me and Nate than you, Gig, so I'm sorry about that.
It's fine, I'll sit back. It's all good.
But you had a lot of UK-specific stuff with Astra, so now the scales have shifted. Najawin says, Neo plus Nate plus other non-Brits, how has your country of origin flavored your approach to the franchise? Do the lack of stories in your home country impact how you think about the show at all? How accurate is the portrayal of your countries in the franchise insofar as it exists? Nate is American, of course.
It's a good question. Yeah, I'd never really thought about it too much, to be honest. And so this kind of made me reflect on, okay, when has America appeared in the TV show? Certainly in, New York City was in seasons 3 and 7. In season 6, and I guess also in Hellbent. And then Florida also in season 6, I believe, right? That wasn't all just in DC. Like maybe it was Texas. Well, regardless, clearly not a very in-depth portrayal of Florida if they were briefly there. I don't know. Florida is where I'm from. So, nothing really stands out in terms of representation, but it hasn't impacted my approach to the franchise, I don't think. What are your thoughts, Neo? I feel like the Australia content's more interesting.
Before I answer, what about the TV movie? How does that play for you? Because that's kind of the most North American Doctor Who-y thing.
Well, in the TV movie, it's more a matter of genre, frankly. I mean, it could be set anywhere. In terms of, is there anything particularly American that affects the plot? Okay, there's gun violence. Maybe I'm just too America goggles to see all the other differences, but it's okay. I think in the TV movie is more an example because of the ways that the show changed to fit American audiences rather than just a matter of setting. Yeah.
I think maybe an interesting point here is that the USA, of course, is the dominant cultural exporter here. As we're all talking about Doctor Who, but the USA rules the roost in terms of cultural exports. The UK is pretty strong there as well, but it's a whole different order of magnitude. Australia, it doesn't really do this much. It's not that interested in doing it, and it's not really happening. We consume culture from other countries, and we're ridden by a concept. I don't know if this is much known outside a country like here. It's called the cultural cringe. It's basically a big social complex it's like an inferiority complex about Australian culture or culture that's specific to Australia. And it links into a lot of other fundamental things about Australian culture, like tall poppy syndrome. I don't know if that's a concept known as much in your countries. Do you guys know that, tall poppy syndrome?
No idea.
If you excel in anything, you have to get chopped down. So it's kind of similar to crabs in a bucket. Everyone needs to be at kind of a similar status, because if you are going above and beyond, you will be pulled down to conform with the rest of the poppies, basically. That's a big kind of aspect of how Australian society works in a lot of ways. Tall poppy syndrome, cultural cringe. There's a big inferiority complex about what's perceived of as Australian culture. And this has been pushed back in some areas to some different effect, but it's pretty strong these days, the conformity to particularly American culture as well. I can't tell you how often I get into arguments with people who are citing all these American laws and American standards at me and talking about American free speech. And even when I explain that everything they're saying doesn't actually apply to the place we are both standing on right now, they don't really understand. I think partially because they've all been raised so immersed in American culture. It's hard to take those blinkers off, because that's, if you're a fish, all you know is water. And I think to an extent, if you're an Australian, to a large degree, what you know is American culture. So the lack of stories being in Australia, therefore, is not weird at all to me, because why would a story be in Sydney? That doesn't really happen. That's very novel if it does happen. It's normal for stories to be in the USA or in the UK. That's normal. If a story was in Australia, that would be odd and notable. It happens sometimes. I know there's little things on the TV show, like the pilot has a little scene, meant to be in Sydney. I think there was a Fifth Doctor older Tegan audio called The Gathering, which is one of the Australian-ish type of stories I remember as kind of hooking into some Australian stuff. There was also, what was it called? There was a Seventh Doctor audio that keyed into some Indigenous things. So it's old Big Finish audios keyed into Australia stuff sometimes in like a more meaningful way than the TV show sometimes does. It's not done often. It's not done often in the TV show, and that's not weird, because why would it be? And also, like we sometimes talk about, I'm very resistant to... I don't want an American to play the Doctor, and I don't want an Australian or a Canadian or someone from New Zealand to play the Doctor. I want the Doctor to be played by a person from the UK, or, well, there's one country I would take in as an exception, but basically the UK. And earlier in our Nate parts of this discussion, Gig has also defended the same thing in, typical British fashion. Not weird that Australia isn't dealt with much in the TV show. Would be weird if it was, because Australia is very used to not being depicted or whatnot, and it's used to conforming to other culture. So pretty normal.
And then you have K9, the Australian spin-off, which pretends to be British, as far as apparently is what I hear. Yeah,
the K9 show made in Australia, a lot of it by Australians and starring a mostly Australian cast, features a bunch of Australians, a lot of them kid actors playing the main kids of the show, pretending they're in London and pretending to have English accents. So it's a really visceral form of the cultural cringe to me, to just watch everyone struggle through with these accents, and they're all sweltering somewhere in Australia, a warehouse or a studio or something, pretending they're in cold old London. It's quite dispiriting to me. But basically, I think I'm worried I'm coming across like saying, oh, Australia sucks, and so there shouldn't be any episodes set there. No, not at all. What I'm saying is that Australia isn't a dominant cultural exporter the way that the USA is, or the UK is to an extent. So as someone from Australia, I just wouldn't have an expectation of, hey, how come that TV show doesn't have episodes set in Australia? Like, why doesn't that TV show of episodes set in Indonesia? Why doesn't that TV show of episodes set in Slovakia? It's like, why would it? I'm not saying it would be a bad thing to happen, not at all. I'm just saying there's not really an expectation, because that would be odd if it did happen. And then if I think about it happening, there's just, I can imagine it connecting with like very superficial aspects of Australian culture that I struggle kind of seeing it being done well. But of course, there's great Doctor Who authors to have come out of Australia, like Kate Orman, and so, yeah. And I'm sure there's stories that connect with Australian culture in the books and whatnot that I haven't experienced, and so who knows what's going on there. But basically, I wouldn't have that expectation. Nate would have more of that expectation, perhaps, because America, cultural exports.
I just want to say one thing. It felt like such a paradigm shift in 2011 when all of a sudden they were going, hey, we're partnering with BBC America, we're doing a story set in America. But now you think, like, these days, you've got the whole Disney Plus partnership, and it just, that sort of thing just feels like it wouldn't be as big of a deal. Like, everything feels so internationalized, if you see what I'm talking about.
I will say that I just drove across America, frankly, and the Clara's Diner itself is like almost spot on. Like, I know it seems like a meme, but I think I stopped in 2 different places just randomly that both reminded me in different elements of Clara's Diner. So that's something.
I like when the show plays with America as well. Like, I love the book Vampire Science with the Eighth Doctor.
Yes.
And I think Miracle Day is quite interesting, and I love the Series 6 Matt Smith premiere. I think that was a fantastic set of episodes. So I think the show does pretty well interfacing with America, at least from my perspective as a not American or British person.
Yeah, America is very... Like, it is true that so much media comes out of America, but they really reuse a lot of the same locations. Like, for the most part, it's just New York. You'll get California in there. Like, I'm sure it's not as flat as I'm making it sound, but, you know, how many things have we seen with New York in it, like, as the main setting? And even Doctor Who does this. Like, 2 of the however many times it's been to America in the new series were in New York, like in plots about New York, which I get because it's iconic. But in terms of like the rest of the country, in terms of the country that I know, you know, that doesn't make it on there as much. So yeah, Series 6 is nice for that. You know, even just for showing the nature.
Najwin has something else to ask. Is the show ready for Iris Wildthyme is the world? I've never really interacted with this character. Can we get a quick rundown?
Oh, she's Paul Mars's creation. He's always been right. Well, whatever. A couple decades ago, he wrote a series of novels called Phoenix Court. They were sort of like magical, realist. You know, it's described as like queer fantasy. And in that, there's a character named Iris Wildthyme, who then started cropping up in his Doctor Who stories, and she's been like a mainstay of the range ever since. Obverse Books, which obviously has gone on to publish so much good Doctor Who content, and the Faction Paradox series, they started to publish anthologies about Iris Wildthyme. There's also a big Finnish series that I think is still going on where she's played by Katie Manning. Just a kind of wild character. Definitely brings a very specific tone to all her stories. Like, her main companion is a stuffed panda. He would object to me calling him a stuffed panda, but you know, he's just a toy. So it's a funny series. Yeah. I don't know if the world is ready for Iris Wildthyme.
Yeah, as I understand it, she's sort of defined by irreverence towards things like logic or continuity and stuff like that. So there's lots of humour about kind of playing with and poking the idea that, I guess, the rules of whatever setting or the Doctor Who universe that she's kind of inserted into. So I think that's kind of what motivates Najwin's question. Is the show ready for a character as transgressive as this? And to be honest, I think, like, yeah. Like, I don't think it would be some huge problem to have a character like Iris from the spin-off show up in the show. I would say, I don't know if it's really needed, because I feel spin-off stuff that's defined by existing outside the boundaries of the official doesn't really need official crossovers like that. I feel like there's a risk of sanitizing stuff when you're trying to get everything to come into the main show and be, you know, cast officially and appear on camera. And it's like, is this really needed? Like, these wild and imaginative things that exist at the boundaries of the show, I mean, they have their own lives. And I almost feel that a need to try and drag them in and get an official Doctor Who version of them, you know, in front of the cameras that can be part of the main canon, it's almost like slightly going against the spirit of things, almost. I mean, obviously there's a limit to how much it really matters, I guess. Like, it wouldn't be a huge problem, but still.
I will say that I think Iris's best stories are the novels where she's, like, there with the Doctor. I do think that dynamic specifically is very entertaining, and I think it could, I suppose, work on the show. But overall, I agree with your analysis that, like, it would... I wouldn't want to see, like, the rough edges sanded off version of Iris that would make it to the TV show. You know, I have faith in RTD, but not as much in Disney in that regard.
The next question is from myself to Nate. Well, I guess theoretically to Gig as well, but firstly to Nate. What would be the most interesting esoterica related to Doctor Who or Faction Paradox or anything like that for us, for Who Cares, to potentially cover one day?
Yeah, great question. So looking back over the last 100 videos, I guess the Dalek Universe series and the Torchwood season review series, and, you know, those kind of audio reviews where it's multiple audios fit together, I think that format would be a good fit for the Faction Paradox audios, specifically if let's see, it's too early to even tease a teaser, but if one day, hypothetically, in the future, something were to come along which produces Faction Paradox audios in a way that retroactively casts the Faction Paradox protocols as season 1 and the true history of Faction Paradox as season 2, and then, continues with, say, season 3 or something along those lines. If that were the case, and that would accompany an overall refocusing of the Faction Paradox brand franchise around the audio content, which used to be definitely the main line. The book started out as tie-ins to the audios. So if we were to see that sort of refocus, I think that would be a great format. Season 1, season 2, it's already nice and organized. We've Who Cares has reviewed some books, right? The Time Traveler's Wife, for one.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of which books would be a good fit for that. But
Not Dead Romance? I mean, that's a really good book. Yeah, and it's kind of standalone, isn't it, in some ways? I know it brings in Chris Fredge, or however the fuck you pronounce his name, but it is sort of, it does tell its own story.
Chevet?
Yeah, Dead Romance is great, and I think that I'm going to have to revise my Faction Paradox, where to start guide, which currently recommends Alien Bodies and Interference, the two big Lawrence Miles, Eighth Doctor books, but I think I'm going to have to change that to focus more on Dead Romance, because even though it does assume some of Quedge's, I'll just go with Quedge, some of his character background, it's not in a way that's really essential to the plot. It's just kind of nice to have for some of the character beats. And also, Chris Quedge is kind of prominent on his own now. There's that as well. So I think there's a lot of reasons for people to be interested in Dead Romance, now you mention it.
Yeah, that all sounds good. What's the overall appeal of Faction Paradox?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. What I like about it specifically is how it looks at Doctor Who as a sort of mythology to draw upon. I think that's what is most rewarding about it for me, because when you're reading it, not only is it really good stories, not only are they set in a time war that is less about lasers and monsters and more about ideas and it's not just about time paradoxes. It's more about culture and ritual, and taking that approach to Doctor Who concepts that I know and love. When I'm reading something and I'm oh, this is so good, and then something clicks and I'm oh, this is a reinvention of this thing that I've seen on the TV show. I don't mean to make it sound like it's all like that. I mean, for the most part, it is just telling its own stories in a really good way. But especially the initial run from Mad Norwegian Press, Obverse has done a great job holding the torch. I really hope that something does come along to kind of push the franchise into its future. Who knows? Sorry, that was a scattered answer. It's a big question, though, I think, Neo.
What do you think, Gig?
What I'd say, I've only experienced limited amounts of kind of faction content. So I read the scripts for the first series of the audios. I've read a bit of the Book of the War, I think is one that I've been looking at. Mm-hmm. And obviously I've read Dead Romance as well. I would say I love, of course, This Town Will Never Let Us Go. I've read that too.
Yes.
Silly me, God, yeah. And that's brilliant. I would say, I think the mythology that it builds up around itself, I think seeing the parallels with Doctor Who is kind of a minor thing for me. I find the mythology really, it's really cool on its own. Mm-hmm. I think I love the lens that it takes to history, and I would say just the way in which it draws out lots of kind of scary ideas and kind of sort of horror ideas in some ways, but explores them in a quite fun, irreverent way. There's a lot of sense of play to it, and how it has these various kind of warring factions, of course the faction itself, kind of battling around in history with kind of very quite just plain cool ideas at various points, like the shadow weapons and stuff like that. I think it's just immensely entertaining, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, the first one that I actually read, not counting Dead Romance, was Warlords of Utopia, which is by Lance Parkin and features it's not as sci-fi gobbledygook as this makes it sound, but it's all the timelines where Rome never fell, going to fight against all the timelines where the Nazis won World War II. And it's just this kind of crazy idea, but it but it works. It works really well. It plays with a lot of ideas about history. As you can imagine, it's written from the perspective of the journal of a Roman, right? It's like an I Claudius knockoff in a way. It's a fun series. But besides Faction Paradox, I think the Caldor City audios would also be a good fit. Those are just phenomenal. And then I also love the Time Hunter books, which are also available now as audiobooks. Those are also really fun. So that's my pitch for Esoterica.
Speaking of Esoterica, Najawin's next thing to say is, what are your thoughts on Lawrence Miles's insanely incorrect comments about Doctor Who coming back as an animated show? Before finishing Najawin's question there, I think I should read out what they're talking about. So, in an interview from...
I think it was like 2000 or 2001.
I think it's May 2000, and there are like web archives of it as early as 2003.
Yes.
Lawrence Miles was asked, are they going to be writing more books? And Lawrence Miles says, no, it means I'm still holding out for Doctor Who, the animated series. And the interviewer says, are you really serious about that? And Lawrence Miles says, only in a long-term pipe dream kind of way. Look, think of it like this. Eventually, there will be another TV series of Doctor Who, and it will fail horribly because inevitably it'll be aimed at the kind of fan-targeted sci-fi market that didn't even exist until Star Trek The Next Generation came along and spoiled everything. Doctor Who only works as a family adventure series, but when it finally comes back, you can bet any money you want it'll be like Babylon 5 or something. It'll only last one series, maybe two. So then the TV program will be dead forever. The license will be in limbo, and nobody will ever want to pump more money into it as a TV concept. Not a live-action TV concept anyway. But animations, just getting to the point where it's breaking through properly. Especially now there's so many computer-generated effects around, and people are starting to forget the difference between real film and CGI. Pretty soon, British animation companies, the Cosgrove Halls of the 21st century, are going to realise that there's a massive amount of potential in a British manga-style movement. We're the perfect country to do that kind of thing, to do the European equivalent of Akira or Ghost in the Shell or whatever. And I want to be there when it happens. And I can't think of a better spearhead for the whole thing than an anime version of Doctor Who. I'm thinking 10 years into the future here, obviously. And the interviewer asks, so if you got the chance to do this, would you tell the whole story of the Time Lord War as you see it? And Lawrence Miles says, well, epic wars are great for animation. Planets getting wiped out, million-strong armies of Cybermen marching across battlefields, Time Lord warships the size of moons, brilliant visuals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, to finish Najawin's question, Najawin says, were the premises he was operating from similar cultural contexts between Japan/Asia and England/Europe, leading to England being likely to start their own animation industry reasonable, even if incorrect? Was he just doing Lawrence Miles things? Should we get animated War in Heaven, please? Spin-offs now?
Yeah, this is a really fun interview quote. I think first we have to address the fact that Lawrence Miles was obviously right when he said that. Just think, about half a decade after he made those comments, the BBC released its Ninth Doctor reboot of the show. It gave the Doctor a new mysterious Time War backstory, introduced a new relatable companion in an adventure also featuring the classic Who baddie from Terror of the Autons, and it was animated, of course, Scream of the Shalka. And while this was a stillborn attempt, because by the time that Shalka was actually out, the BBC Wales series was already on the books, and so a lot of the attention and budget had gone in a different direction. I mean, this was like the vision for the future of Doctor Who, and it was as an animated series. So while it sounds kind of out there to read this, oh, the failure of TV, he's right that if Russell T Davies had taken a Babylon 5 approach, it wouldn't have worked. I think we can recognize that RTD went in a very different direction. So even even though obviously the exact timeline that Lawrence Miles laid out there didn't come to pass, I think that this, this idea seems crazy to us in hindsight, but it's very much in the continuum of reasonable ideas that people were having about the future of the franchise at that point. Yeah, I mean, hey, with the democratization of animation, for better or worse, I think that we're very likely to see some kind of animated Doctor Who content in the future. What do you guys think?
I want to know what Lawrence Miles, if he were to ever see it, would think of the James Goss Daleks animated series.
I know that the nation of state supposedly wasn't too enthusiastic about that. Yeah. I think, hey, Star Trek, right? Going back to our last talk, Star Trek has that animated spin-off, right? I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it does.
The comedy one, yeah.
It has two, actually, doesn't it? Because you've got the comedy one, then you've got the CGI one, which is sort of aimed at kids and more of an adventure type thing. So it's got two animated spin-offs, I believe.
Wow.
I think the conception of the UK as being like the spearhead of some kind of British equivalent of anime, and that being a whole industry. I mean, clearly none of that really came to pass in any genuine sense. And I am curious about why he felt that was. It just seems to be like a different conception of the UK's role culturally, almost in the world. Like, obviously, he mentions Cosgrove Hall, and obviously they did some really good like animation. I think they worked on some of the reconstructions, actually, or at least one of them maybe at some point. And obviously there's stuff like the original animated film with the BFG, and that's really gorgeously animated and stuff. But that has not over the decades, that hasn't turned into an honest to god like British. I mean, it just feels ridiculous to even say. I feel like Miles, he consumes a lot of cultural stuff, doesn't he? Like, when he's on Twitter, he's talking about pulp detective novels and Bagpuss and all this stuff that's kind of going around in his brain. So maybe when he made these comments, he was just kind of thinking, well, this stuff's really interesting, and how can this kind of be brought in to stuff that I like? I'm not sure how credible the whole concept of like the British manga movement really was.
Yeah.
Well, look, the UK, Japan, both islands off the coast of a continent. I mean, it's basically 1-to-1. I don't see what else there is to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last question I've got was on YouTube, and it's from LED557. And I think this will work well to have Nate part of the answer to this. So LED says, "Congrats, love the discussions. It would be cool to hear some discussion of the similarities between Face the Raven, Heaven Sent, Hellbent, and Neverland, Zagreus, Scherzo from the Big Finish 8th Doctor audios. Even if not a conscious parallel on Moffat's part, they are strikingly similar. The Doctor attempts to save his companion from her history-ordained death, an action which we are told will cause the destruction of the web of time. The Time Lords fret over an ancient, legendary boogeyman monster who will destroy Gallifrey. There is impending doom in prophecies given by the Matrix's projections of the future. The Doctor is forced into a self-contained realm in which he repeats the same actions over and over again, being stalked by a strange creature. And during that experience, he is forced to come to terms emotionally with how he views the mortality of his companions. The Doctor also returns to his home planet. Rassilon is positioned as a villain, and the far future ruins of Gallifrey feature. And so it's interesting to look at the ways they differ in their approach and how they inform each other. Was it Moffat vaguely channeling or bouncing off of those stories? Do they intertextually create some greater meaning? I'd love to hear what you think if you're interested."
Yeah, big question. It definitely made me kind of go back and relook at those audios, because when I have listened to them in the past, and I first listened to them a very long time ago, so in some ways it's hard for me to do an objective assessment of them, but I still think that they're like they're formative to me, I can say. But they're Scherzo in particular is like a extremely good character driven story in my view, or at the very least it's heart wrenching. And when I've listened to them in the past and thought about the parallels that they have with other Doctor Who stories, I naturally, as fits my neuroses, have focused on the Eighth Doctor books. The whole parallels between Zagreus and the grandfather paradox, possession of the Doctor. Like, a lot of these same themes keep coming up. Of course, we have Romana in Neverland as a sort of Imperiatrix versus the very similar War Queen Romana that we see in the Eighth Doctor books. So, it was really fun to kind of go back and be like, oh, there are so many more parallels. I don't think that this is a case of Moffat intentionally copying. I know that gets accused, that gets leveled on Moffat a lot. I think that he and the writers of those audios and the writers of the books were all kind of steeped in the same cultural landscape and the same ideas about Doctor Who that were percolated online and in person at the tavern, etc. And so it makes sense that the same kind of specific ideas would pop up. But some of these are just tropes going back to classic Who. Like, oh, an ancient legendary boogeyman of the Time Lords. This isn't... it makes sense that two different Doctor Who stories would feature that. But I will say that what I think makes Hellbent and the Series 9 trilogy better is that whereas in the main range audios, the main threat, the whole anti-time thing, is something that happens to the Doctor and his companion that forces them to kind of revisit their relationship with each other. Whereas in Series 9, I think Moffat plays on a lot of these same tropes specifically to subvert them. Because up until the very end, we might think, oh, the hybrid is...
Cyber Dalek.
Some ancient threat, some generic monster like what is it in The Power of Three? Chibnall introduced us to another time.
Shakira's
Shakri, yeah.
That's right.
What happened to the Shakri? Right, we had ancient anyway. Whereas Moffat, he picks up all these tropes specifically to subvert them, because in the end, it's not an external thing that's making the Doctor reconsider his relationship with Clara and all of that. Instead, it is that relationship itself, which I think is just brilliant. It's kind of it would be just as well if that was the final statement on that whole genre of epic Doctor Who finale. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
I think both of these trilogies, I guess the crux of them is the idea of the Doctor and companion being close in a way that is dangerous and creates friction. I think when they were writing 8 and Charlie, and they have this whole, I guess, this romance and lots of kind of tortured feelings between the two of them. And I think Charlie eventually, in this story, she stows away on the TARDIS, doesn't she, when the Doctor kind of doesn't want her to, and that leads them to get into this whole Divergent Universe kind of mess with each other. I think it's an obvious hook if what you're trying to do is an interpretation of Doctor Who more focused on, obviously, on characters and on conflict. I think the idea of a Doctor and companion as dangerous and close, I think that is a natural idea that emerges, and emerges again when Moffat is doing a similar thing with the Capaldi era, and that's how you get 12 and Clara with their relationship, because a similar kind of thing happens. It's a bit different in some crucial ways, but you have 12 and Clara getting uncomfortably close to each other, kind of Clara almost chasing after the Doctor in some ways, which leads to her, face the Raven, but it's basically her trying to emulate the Doctor leads to her death, right? Interesting one crucial difference you might point to is that in when 8 saves Charlie from her preordained death, it's just because he's met her, she's already ordained to die at that point. He meets her, he plucks her out of that situation that would kill her. Whereas Clara, she only dies because, it's as a consequence of her meeting the Doctor and becoming so much like him. He brings her into the situation and she ends up, getting herself killed. So that seems like an important, I guess, a different approach to that idea of the preordained companion death. It's not just a case of the laws of time are unfair. It's a case of the Doctor is rebelling against these consequences that he has, in a way, brought upon himself by getting so embroiled with Clara. But I suppose in another sense, and we know there is maybe a bit of Moffat's sort of engaged with Big Finish in some ways. I think
Yeah.
there's nothing about him pitching to them at one point. I mean, I don't know to what extent like he might have been influenced by Shearman or whatever. But when you look at Scherzo from the audios, and you look at Moffat doing these projects during Compelled Era where he tried to challenge himself to write something really experimental. So Listen, Heaven Sent, probably Extremist is similar. I think the impulse behind those stories is kind of, you can see the DNA it shares with stuff like Shearman's or Natural History of Fear, some of that Divergent Universe stuff. The idea of a writer going, putting themselves into this zone where I think, okay, how can I write a story that really upends the conventions of Who? And in the early years of Big Finish, they were doing that a lot. They don't do it quite as much in the TV show, but I think when Moffat was in that phase of his career, when he was thinking, how can I do this? I think again, it's parallels more than necessarily direct influence. I think it's the same sort of thing. When you get a writer in that situation who wants to write that kind of story, that happens. So I think that's why that parallel sort of emerges.
That's such an interesting point. I never thought about the fact that Heaven Sent is basically a Shearman like story. In all his specific sort of like, he's always set in a puzzle box in a way, a specific location that is itself in a way alive. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's basically Holy Terror in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, and Moffat and RTD have both shouted out Charlie Pollard's stories before, and so there's certainly engagement going on there. I think the interesting thing there is Zagreus, which I am a fan of. That has less parallels to the Series 9 sequence of episodes there. So that's maybe the more original. It's the sort of thing I don't think will ever happen again, because I know that David Tennant's 60th anniversary doesn't seem to be in the pattern of anniversaries we usually get, where it's, there's more than one Doctor and they say, hey, you do a thing differently and here's my catchphrases and let's exchange catchphrases. It looks like the Catherine Tate, David Tennant reunions aren't going to be the same way that, the 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, the Day of the Doctor, and, untold scores of hours from Big Finish and the comics and whatnot do. So I guess anniversaries aren't always going to be that pattern because RTD is breaking out of that. But Zagreus is the big, let's do something, bizarrely different. Let's do a very bizarre story full of bizarre things. Let's not even have actors play the roles that people kind of tune in for. So I think that's the kind of code, the combo breaker there, I think, is Zagreus, which I know Neverland sets up a lot of the stuff that LED's pointed out here, but I think Zagreus is the one that kind of conforms less to these parallels, which is, interesting. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just because they're great ideas, and some of it may well be influence. And, I really like both those sequences of stories. I love Series 9, and I love the 8th Doctor Charlie stuff. So we're spoilt there, getting 2 runs with some of those similarities.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about how they treat the whole Gallifreyan epic aspect. I wonder, because obviously there's such a gap of time between them, and by 2015, I guess those ideas of this is the big crisis, the destruction of Gallifrey, the ancient threat, all of that, I guess it feels a lot less, maybe in 2015, it didn't have as much gravity, because we'd had all this stuff about the Time War, and, the universe ending over and over and over again. So maybe by that point, I guess maybe just the franchise in general was more of a place where someone writing those ideas is inclined to actually subvert them in some ways, whereas I guess Neverland is more of a straightforward take on those ideas like anti-time and all that stuff. And that's and that whole Neverland arc is setting up. Yeah, I guess it's bringing the stakes as high as they can be to transition to the next Divergent Universe phase and stuff. Whereas I think with New Who, because New Who it's already so self-reflective, and it's already it's analysed and deconstructed all these mythos and lore things so much. I guess it's almost like the biggest stakes in New Who come from going small and focusing a lot on just the Doctor and Clara and what exists between them. So you get the Gallifrey stuff forms more of a backdrop to that, and it gradually falls away.
There's kind of a heaven sent hell bent thing with like. I don't know if I'm really making this comparison, but like Neverland does so much setup of a certain sort that you're expecting the resolution to work a certain way. The same way that people were expecting a lot of people were expecting a certain type of story to follow Heaven Sent, especially with, what the ending sets up. We're back on Gallifrey, big Gallifrey things are about to happen. And then Hellbent, kind of sidelines it and it does this super character-y episode instead. Zagreus doesn't do that, but it sidelines all of Neverland's setup to just do a really bizarre kind of surreal exploration of I guess the Doctor's character is kind of the clearest way, maybe you could say that. It does something very different. And it's got this really weird quality to it where Zagreus kind of repeats a lot of the setup from Neverland with slightly different terms or in slightly different ways. There's this very odd redundancy factor to Zagreus I've always found strange, where I forget all the terms, but I know like Neverland sets up the Never people or whatever, and then Zagreus kind of does that again and it gives them a different name, and it's like the same idea, it's doing slightly differently. So there's a real singularity to, the same man wrote Heaven Sent and Hell Bent, so you can't say there was anything lost in the transfer there. Zagreus has kind of a weird quality where it almost does actually feel like someone's wresting something away from what Neverland was doing. But I guess it's just interesting to me that even in 2003, we were kind of getting we're always setting up a million cool things to happen on Gallifrey, or are we? Now let's do something weirder.
Yeah.
Zagreus isn't like a big character piece like Hellbent, and I'm not saying it's as successful as Hellbent because I don't think it is, even though I do like Zagreus. But it's interesting that even back then, the idea of what if we don't do the big expected, typically dramatic Gallifrey finale was kind of around, especially because I think these Eighth Doctor seasons with Charlie were one of the things to really formalize the idea of a capital F finale in Doctor Who. I think like Neverland is a very kind of seminal statement in kind of finales in Doctor Who. I'm sure the books have versions of this as well, but I don't think Classic Who did as much. And Neverland feels like a New Who finale, even though it comes years before Bad Wolf Parting of the Ways. So there's some interesting stuff going on there.
Just shout out a little parallel between Zagreus and Moff stuff. I think the way Zagreus has actors not playing their characters, I think Moff did call back to that a little bit in Day of the Doctor with Billy Piper.
Yeah, that's true.
Playing the moment. So you have a classic.
Well, and of course Tom Baker is the curator, not quite the Fourth Doctor. Yeah.
Yeah, not quite. Although I do think Billy as the moment is almost like that could almost be from that Zagreus era, because you've got this big Gallifreyan thing,
yeah,
but it's in the face and voice of someone you recognise. I feel like that period of the audios was doing that stuff quite a dramatic degree.
Yeah. LED, we love those stories, so it's always interesting to talk about those. We love both sequences there. Well, we all love Scherzo. I don't know if our opinions on Neverland and Zagreus are all the same, but it's an interesting sequence of stories we've all heard. So, yeah, interesting stuff.
Maybe just one little thing to say about that. I think in the way that in Series 9, the hybrid ends up being, I guess, the idea of the Doctor partnered with a companion who is dangerous for him, I guess you could almost say that, if you wanted to, you could maybe start to say that maybe 8 and Charlie represent something similar.
Yeah.
So it's like the hybrid is almost like a running theme. I mean, and Zagreus climaxes with the Doctor becoming Zagreus, being possessed by Zagreus or some shit like that, doesn't it? I think
yes.
The idea that Clara and 12 don't have to be the only instance of the hybrid or hybrid type thing happening in Doctor Who, I guess. If you want to extend it, you could almost say that it could be something that could happen with any companion if it was the right circumstances.
That's so interesting. It's got to happen again as well. It's like such a just fundamental, as you said, what if the Doctor and the companion were bad for each other? Like, it's not the craziest idea in the world. It's a good platform to go off of. Maybe not for another 10 years, but we'll see it. I
think Charlie and 8 were like a kind of formative, sometimes sloppy, sometimes underdone, but a brave and ambitious and interesting attempt to do a much kind of, to do a companion-doctor relationship that really was about the relationship, like the actual link between the two characters a lot and what that meant to the both of them and how they do or don't change each other. I think there was a lot of probing going on in there, which, clearly New Who did as well. And, Russell's talked about, like, he even says Rose's name comes across, he didn't want to name another companion in the same kind of male style that Sam from the books and Charlie from the audios were named. So Russell's interfacing with all these companions as well. And of course, Moffat, loves Chimes of Midnight. And so I think there's a definite interplay between all this stuff. And I think Charlie and 8 didn't always work super cleanly. But there was a lot of bravery and boldness with what they were trying to do with, let's do a sequence of stories like seasons in a row where we actually really look at how the companion influences the Doctor, how the Doctor influences the companion, the weird relationship they have together. And I guess what distinguishes that from Ace and the Seventh Doctor on TV is that there is more of a kind of intimacy factor with Charlie and Eight, which of course New Who would leap off, not just in like a romantic Rose way, but in the kind of Clara way as well of, the level of connection and whatnot. So there's a kind of cool proto-New Who-ness to Charlie and Eight, but there's also a cool kind of scattered ambition of, there wasn't a manual on how to do that sort of thing back then. So it doesn't always work in the audios, but it's always interesting what they're doing with Charlie and Eight there. Except for when she turned into a big... wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, I'm good.
I guess now you have me thinking about Two and Rose, but nothing that I can turn into a thought. So,
yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Nate. That was fun to go through those questions together. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to talk to you.
Yeah, best of luck with the rest of your ambitious recording schedule.
Farewelling Nate for this discussion now. That was our last guest on this one. Back to just Gig and I, and we're in specific, in-depth Doctor Who questions. I was almost taken aback at some of these. Really, really interesting questions here. Ones where you have to stop and think about and ponder for a couple of days before answering them on this discussion. So we'll start going back to Roaches on YouTube, who says, do you think Doctor Who will inevitably end one day, just like every other TV show, or could it really go on forever? And if it did end in the far future, could fans like RTD just revive it again?
I suppose, putting aside all the obvious kind of platitudes and sort of truisms about the show, how it can go on forever and stuff, I think if it eventuated that anything resembling the BBC broke up in some way, there was nothing resembling a BBC anymore, that might lead to Who being dead in a genuine sense, notwithstanding some horrible private resurrection at a later date. But in terms of, obviously, the premise of it allows you to keep writing it. I think the nature of it as something that ends a lot means that an end doesn't have to be the last end, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, I say even if it ends, it's not really, like, condemned to never restart. I think it is... Yeah, but again, it's more about the circumstances of how it's getting produced, I think. I think that it's plausible there could be a scenario where no one is interested in reviving it anymore, and it would have to be a very, very dire situation for that, and I think it would have to be a situation where it can't be revived in a way that's true to itself, I suppose. And that is more contingent on like who's around to produce it.
In my opinion, it is a strong brand in an era where IP is everything, and more importantly, it is a merchandisable brand. You can make lots and lots of toys on it, and it's not just kids buying the toys. It's big adults buying the really expensive toys. As long as British society is functioning in a kind of similar-ish way to it is now, without any huge changes to how life works or the entertainment industry works, it's going to be getting made in some form or another because there is money to be made here. That's maybe a more mercantile answer, but you can make toys of this, so it's going to keep happening.
That's your answer. Overthrow the British state, we can finally kill Doctor Who and let it end, as 12 would have wanted. So, there you go.
Obviously, you could still make toys of Classic Who, and that did happen, and it went off air anyway. There are always ways that incompetence can win over money-making. Like, that can happen. I'm just doubtful in, like, the 21st century that it could get snared up in certain ways. Like Gig says, if certain rights-holding situations collapse, like the BBC, there are ways it could get snared away. Although I think now that Disney's kind of in the pie, that it's going to keep happening in some way. But basically, the fact that you can sell expensive toys and home media releases of this makes me think, as long as something really moronic doesn't happen, it's going to keep getting made, basically. It's not a dead brand, the way fans often like to nonsensically talk about at all. It makes a lot of money. Anyway, Roaches goes on to say, what kind of storytelling gimmicks would you like to see Doctor Who do or redo? I personally need a musical Doctor Who episode in my life, or maybe the show could have another go at a found footage episode like Sleep No More.
A musical would be cool. I've also thought that maybe, sort of building off the found footage thing, I think something more of a handheld camera mockumentary type. Like, if you think about the way they shoot, like The Thick of It or something done like that could be potentially quite cool in a Doctor Who format, sort of fake documentary. Alternatively, maybe a silent episode or a black and white episode. Like, not particularly creative ideas on my part, but sure, anything they want to do, just do it. There's no reason to hold back.
Way back in the day, half of ABBA the male half, proposed doing a Torchwood musical.
Wow.
Judging by the writer's tale, Russell kind of laughed it off, is my impression. I might be misreading him. And I've seethed ever since. That should have happened. ABBA Torchwood musical. I've never wanted anything more. So I love musicals. I really, really love musicals. So I would love some sort of musical Doctor Who thing. Absolutely. Yeah, and any format mix-up I'm into. I don't care if it doesn't even work. It's just a very fun thing to do in general, especially in a show as long as this one. Any format shake-up, I'd be down for. Absolutely. We have an email from Matt the Danger, who says, "You're in danger." No, he says, "Hello, big fan of the podcast. I really love your layered discussions and distinct lack of fan brain. This huge bloat of terrible nerd Doctor Who content, but yours is really streets ahead. I particularly love Gig.
Aww.
And his passionate rants and way of articulating himself. I would never ask him to force one or be a performing monkey, but I was wondering, what really grinds your gears? The state of media and contentization of art in 2023, the shambles of UK government, fandom in general. Love you guys. Keep up the amazing work."
Okay, so that feels like a prompt for me, specifically to kind of go off on some soapbox things. Unfortunately, I wrote some stuff down. Okay. Well, I'll sort of take each of those individually. What really grinds your gears? Okay, well, there's something that has been grinding my gears a lot lately, and I would say it's the way in which, speaking from a UK perspective here, the way in which some of our most depraved racists, Islamophobes, blackfacers, white supremacists, basically, people who love the thought of supposedly uncivilized Arabs being bombed, starved, sniped, bulldozed out of their homes, these people are casually rebranded by our simpering press as anti-racist experts whenever it's convenient and they need to hound some black or brown person or some socialist out of public life. I find it straight up twisted. And that's the thing, it's not enough to just lie in the UK. We have to have an endless cultural gaslighting where everything must be upside down. Everything evil is made out to be just fine, and basic compassion or understanding for those suffering before your eyes is made out to be something unspeakably evil. And I think what it is it's the paradox of life in an imperial core country. I think it has to furiously shut down the obvious truths that our policy helps make people's lives brutal, miserable, and short. It has to invert reality in order to sustain itself and all its founding assumptions. It has to erase the incomprehensible terrorism we and our mates are doing. It has to pretend that, say, terrorism just pops up randomly in the heads of people who happen to be our enemies, and it has to call anyone who disagrees an apologist for terror, so we never ever have to reckon with what we've done, or, God forbid, stop doing it. So I think that results in just the insane complexes that we have, like in the press, in the media, in this country, in politics, where everything is upside down and cruelty is just laundered and practiced inevitably, indefinitely, forever. And everyone good is hounded and smeared as the worst human being on earth. And the most depraved freaks in existence are lauded and vaunted as blimmin' cinnamon rolls who can do nothing wrong. That drives me insane. Okay, part 2. The state of media and contentization of art in 2023. I would like there to be less of it. Next question. The shambles of UK government. Well, on that front, I would say we're in hell, because they're all in a big club, shaking hands for their favourite racist news outlets, and triangulating who to criminalise, punish, stigmatise next, to satiate the appetite for cruelty, while pointedly not adjusting their hollow economic lies and promises. I think what's happened, what's become very obvious, is that the entire concept of electoral solutions to this country's problems is a burning trash fire right now, and the only way anything will ever be achieved is through increased, widespread industrial disruption. I think of all the defining elements of Britishness, the one that must die before it kills us all first is deference. Because deference has been inculcated into us, like all of us, on every level, every class level, every educational level, pretty much from childhood, and we just have a crippling problem with it. And last of all, fandom in general. This is not really related, but I think if there's anything that feels like a summative negative trend in fandom to me, besides all the obvious ones, I think it's the recuperation of fandom into marketing. Okay, I think the fan base of something and fanish behaviours are now tools. There's something to be managed officially. I think you have this uncomfortable proximity between the official and fans' fears. You have attempts on the parts of brand and brand managers and stuff to try and conjure and manipulate certain fan behaviors, consumption behaviors. You have brands trying to integrate with the fans and make fans into marketers almost. So fans becoming influencers, loyalists, and fans getting access if they behave, all the while just promoting, I guess, compulsory consumption as a lifestyle. And I think what that misses is that the spark of a fan community is independence. That's the utopian thing about it. Because as fans of something, we can be irreverent about it because we aren't beholden to it. We can say no. We can have other interests and be richer people. And I feel that's being gently flattened by a modern fan culture that's kind of been reincorporated. I think also, I guess there's just more promotion of being a fan as something that you cultivate and stylize your individual self as, rather than part of a community that you engage with other people with. So yeah, I guess it's just general, I guess the neoliberalization of fandom is probably the way to summarize all of that. So yeah, those are all of my soapboxes for now. I hope you enjoyed those. Sorry I didn't start screaming or anything.
Well said. Should we just move on to the next thing?
Do you have anything to comment on those questions, or are you good for now?
Oh, I have my own soapboxes, but they're not to do with the UK, so I won't get into those.
Yeah.
On YouTube, Sean Flaherty, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your surname, Sean. Sean says, what sort of big, temporary format genre change along the lines of the Pertwee era would you think would work good for the show? Sean, literally any of them.
Yeah. Like anything at all, just anything to break the sort of, I guess, the stranglehold of the conventions of Doctor Who that have become so solidified for a couple of decades at this point. Even like before the end of Classic Who, there's there's conventions that still haven't quite been stripped away. In terms of specific ideas, I'd be kind of interested to see, this isn't maybe that big of a thing, but I'd be interested to see a whole series with either no Earth, or Earth is somewhere that's difficult to access, or God, even just one with no UK set episodes. just mix it up a bit. Yeah, I know. Obviously, I don't want to get away from like the obvious inherent. It's natural for the show to gravitate towards Earth and the UK, but I think it is also good and healthy for it to try and get away from that and do other things. Like, obviously, I don't need the whole thing. I don't need the whole show to be generic alien planets, but like, nonetheless, I think just forcing yourself to break out of the conventions is usually it's going to prompt some new ideas. I think so. It's worth trying. Oh, we talked about a procedural in the past, haven't we? The idea of like police procedural Who. We hoped Chib would do that. I think that could still be fun if anyone ever wants to do that. It's a very it could be a clever thing to ape, because that kind of show is super popular like here, and I think there are conventions you could adapt to Who, and the idea of like a Monster of the Week thing in a police procedural sort of format. You could do potentially quite fun things with that. I
love the show that Doctor Who has been since, like, I guess, I don't know, Robot, the Tom Baker era. It's adventures in time and space, and it works a certain way. The companions work a certain way. The TARDIS works a certain way. I'm overstating the case here, but I think the Pertwee era was super different from what came before and what came after. And then I think there's a general kind of way Doctor Who stories have worked, which tends to kind of be how things went in Tom, Peter, Colin, Sylve's TV, and then all the New Who Doctors eras. Just a basic way the show kind of works, which is good. Like, obviously I love that format, but I would love for something Pertwee level to happen again, like Sean's talking about. The thing I kind of imagine, like if I'm just daydreaming, or like if I'm in bed dozing off and I'm just kind of imagining, if I was running Doctor Who, what would I do? Is I would love to, like, unlimited budget and have the Doctor, for some reason, be like, they're on another world, and they're like at the start of the world, like, the volcano, like, in Hyde, how we go and see like the formation of the Earth kind of thing on the planet. I would love them to be like there. And I would love like the series to just be like a long way around thing of we see the animals evolve and the Doctor interact with them. And eventually we see the intelligent species evolve. And then we like see the Doctor interact with them through their whole history up through space travel. Like the Doctor is no TARDIS or whatever for this season. And so like the end of it is the human people develop space travel and they get the Doctor back to the TARDIS or whatever. That would be my dream. Is like this kind of fantasy-ish thing of like we spend most of our time in like humans evolving from like medieval kind of eras going up, and then eventually we go to like their modern eras and stuff, and the Doctor is like this constant figure through their history up until when they can help the Doctor get back to the TARDIS. That's like my just kind of vague daydream series I think about of the show sometimes. I think something like that where the idea is all about the Doctor living forever and people, the Mayfly kind of thing. I think that would be an interesting thing to do.
Sort of an expansion of Time of the Doctor almost, isn't it? That's kind of vaguely similar premise with 11 on Translawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, and then you could have like individual, like in the medieval era, the Doctor has to deal with something, and then in like the modern era, the Doctor has to deal with something. I think that'd be really interesting. That's my kind of daydream is of that.
Before we move on, I would say on the whole, I don't even necessarily need like a full-on whole era change like Pertwee. I think what I really like is the earliest era of the show, so like with Hartnell, it wasn't quite solidified how it was going to work. So they do lots of different, strange, curious, interesting things, and I would love the show to feel like that again. I would love the sense of unpredictability to return. The idea that we don't have a locked format. We're not quite sure what's going to come next. We are trying different insane things every few weeks. I think that kind of thing. I would love the idea of going back to that kind of volatile feeling.
Yeah.
And I think to a certain extent, some of Capaldi almost broaches on that sense of like anything being able to happen, but it's still very much within the conventions.
That actually leads into my next question, because there's one Capaldi episode which ends in a very non-Doctor Who way, doesn't it? It's actually quite a very unorthodox ending for the show. And I know the writer wanted to do a second part to the episode, which probably would have homogenized the ending, I'm just totally assuming here, into more of a Doctor Who-y shape, but I love that Gatiss didn't, because it let this episode kind of stand alone with a very kind of an ending you don't get often in the show. So this question is from Twitter, from the Jackalope, who says, Neo, can we hear your attempts to defend Sleep No More for a laugh? I was a bit confused by how this question was framed. It's just probably a tone over online thing, but I felt kind of weirdly on the back foot with the for a laugh bit, especially because I'm not a big Sleep No More guy in the first place. So I had to think what the Jackalope was referencing here. And so I asked someone else who ascertained to me that I'd mentioned Sleep No More recently in our discussion with Oliver on one of the Chibnall commentaries things, when we were talking about the general way writers are kind of hired on Doctor Who in kind of the non-writer's room format, the kind of individual kind of the showrunner hires a writer and how that all works in the UK. And we were talking about that leading to high highs and low lows. It's not as homogenous the way that an American writer room setup can be, was what we were discussing. And I used In the Forest of the Night as an example of that kind of, you can get an episode that's kind of wacky and maybe a low, in some people's opinion. Oliver said he actually really likes that episode. And so I kind of conceded saying, oh, well, I defend parts of Sleep No More. So Oliver and I are fair and even there. I don't know if you remember that gig.
Yeah, I remember what you're talking about. Yeah. I was there.
It's just a brief little lighthearted exchange. It wasn't me trying to draw like a battle line of Sleep No More. I don't think Sleep No More is some misunderstood masterpiece, which I have the key to unlock. I don't think that at all. I think the issues with Sleep No More are pretty plain to anyone watching it, especially if you're watching the cast in that episode. But also, I think it does do some formalistically interesting things, which is really cool for Doctor Who to actually use the cinematography as a key part of the storytelling in a pretty creative way. It's something that I haven't even seen many found footage movies really do, how it uses the kind of cameras to do a reveal with the Clara stuff in that episode. And like we were kind of talking about, I think the ending is cool. It's unorthodox. It's a very spooky ending for Doctor Who. So that's pretty cool. I'm sure one day we'll have a proper discussion about all these Series 9 stories and we can get more in depth into Sleep No More there.
I recall once upon a time you were insisting it was a two-parter with Face the Raven, weren't you?
That's...
They're twinned in some way, structurally.
That's not a discussion for today.
No.
But we need to rewatch. I'm not doing that here, but I haven't totally written that off. We'll talk about it someday. Back to Narjuin on YouTube. Narjuin asks, what other fictional universes have you totally headcanoned as being part of the Doctor Who universe?
I will say, well, I don't tend to really think about things this way specifically. I mean, obviously it's fun to imagine Who crossing over with pretty much anything. I mean, but the show is not consistent enough with itself that you try and dredge up consistency with anything else. But I would say, why not Twin Peaks? I don't know. Sure, there's enough surreal shit going on in that show that you can kind of vaguely slot it into the Doctor Who fantasy realm. Do you have any, Neo?
Maybe that Blake 7 crossover would have been interesting. Earlier this year, 2023, I listened to one of those Derek Jacobi box sets, which was called Escape from Reality, which was about basically the Master's being pursued by some nasty Daleks in the Time War, and the way he finds to escape is like going into the land of fiction, basically. And so then every story in the box set is him in a different fictional reality. Like the first one, he's in Greek mythology, And then there's other ones where he like goes into Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray. And there's different ones there. I don't know if that's really an answer, but it's kind of an adjacent thing that I thought was pretty cool. So Narjuan, if you're into those sort of audios, maybe listen to Escape from Reality, because it's all about Derek Jacobi's master going into other fictional universes and thereby infecting Doctor Who-ness into them. It's quite good. Now Narjuan asks a big one. Narjuan says, Gig, and anyone else who wants to comment. As an American, it's always felt to me that the defining issue of our political and cultural landscape is race relations. You can't really escape it, and those cultural touchstones that attempt to escape it are almost conspicuous in how they attempt to avoid it. For example, sitcoms where black people just don't exist. Do you feel that American cultural dominance has taught other countries, particularly the UK, I mean, since we're talking about Doctor Who, the wrong lessons about the racial inequalities that exist in their own societies, either thinking the issues are closer to being solved than they actually are, or focusing on the wrong areas?
What I would say to that is, I think, if anything, shockwaves from America and American culture set off more awareness of and outrage against, I guess, racism and race relations here than maybe there might be otherwise. So, for example, a while back over here, there was a spate of stuff like in Bristol, where I live, there were some people toppling statues of slavers like Edward Colston in the river, and that was fun. But I think that was kind of sparked off and maybe slightly copycatting similar things happening in America. So I think there's almost like a way in which, I think if anything, rather than American cultural dominance kind of teaching people in the UK to be sort of ignorant about race relations, I think if anything, it's more a lack of historical understanding on the UK side. I feel we don't quite have any sort of proper cultural education to absorb about our own relationship with race, the way that maybe Americans often have, like, with their own. I think the fact that here in the UK, we collectively suffer the architects of something like the Windrush scandal to share our oxygen, I think that says it all. I think the way in which we don't really grasp or appreciate the significance of the way race has played into this country, it feels like it feels so subtextual. Whereas in America, it's like Nodgeman says, it can be treated as a defining aspect of their landscape. So yeah, I would say it is significant and important in the UK, but it's just sort of, it's not really American cultural dominance that's caused it to be swept maybe somewhat under the rug. I think it is just the way that the UK works, the way it's structured, the makeup of it, I think. So I'm not really putting the blame on America for this one.
In my opinion, Australia is entirely and holistically subliminated to the United States in every facet, culturally and politically and economically and everything. So it's kind of asking about the air we breathe, this sort of question. Like, Australia will kill itself it'll light itself on fire to keep America vaguely warm. Basically, that's what Australia is, in my opinion. So it's like talking about cultural dominance. It's talking about drinking water. In that sense. But the way Gig was talking about, I know the George Floyd protests did bring more, people were more fired up here to protest about Australia's own issues, like Indigenous people's deaths in incarceration and stuff like that being totally out of scale and the mistreatment happening there. So I get what Gig was talking about, that's kind of the flip side of American cultural dominance, is when things are kicking off over there, the same issues in the other countries that American is dominating culturally kind of get brought to the fore in that way. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I'd say particularly over the past decade, rather than teaching people that racism is solved, I would say American media has maybe been more inclined to, well, say kind of the opposite. I would say certainly there's been a lot more American media engaging with the idea that actually race is not like a solved thing. It's not just some nice tidy thing where we're all happy and in harmony and there's nothing bad going on at all. Yeah, I think the more racism becomes, I guess, like just the more there's like a massive like diet neo-Nazi movement in America going on, the more I think that has shockwaves and ripples over. So yeah, I don't think American media gives a sort of everything is fine appearance at all at the moment.
At the end of the day, even with America's cultural domination of these Western countries, all countries have their own extant contradictions and tensions, and that's just a part of it. They even look where a country is, like physically. That's a huge part of Australia's kind of death cult ideology right now is geopolitical. So there's only so much cultural dominance can really do at the end of the day. We all are in certain places.
I think there's also a dimension to racism which isn't just confined to within like your country and within different ethnic groups in your country, but also in terms of how like your general media and your like political foreign policy is directed at other countries, and the way in which other people in other countries can be dehumanized a lot. There is a hugely racist element to that. And when you think about the way in which like the US and the UK are kind of embroiled in the same, I guess, block almost in terms of their like political approach and foreign policy, I think there's a way in which a certain racism towards like people in the Middle East is hugely normalized like between both the countries. It's not a case of America giving that to the UK or the other way around. It's something that is shared and like very much mutual, and that is like and that's a reflection of like imperial relations and structures as well.
Yeah,
I think we've given that a fair answer. I don't think we need to. Yeah.
Anyway, on YouTube, Milky Boy says, I've always enjoyed behind the scenes features from any media I watch, and a lot of my interest in the production side of media came from Doctor Who Confidential when I was a kid. Do you think having more easily accessible behind the scenes material eases some of the more harsher criticism thrown at Doctor Who or media in general?
I would say maybe from fans a little bit, but I think your average hater with Doctor Who doesn't necessarily engage with the show enough to devour all the behind the scenes stuff at all. What I would say is that the lack of behind the scenes since Confidential died, sort of around the start of Moffo, I would say it's created a bit more distance and inscrutability between the audience and the show. I think the lack of a clear narrative of what the show's trying to achieve, given directly from the show, like from Confidential or something, the lack of that means that fans start inventing their own insane narratives. I think maybe if we'd had Capaldi era Confidential, there might be a few less sort of strange assertions about what the intent was behind, say, Series 8 or like Capaldi's character, or like what was happening behind the scenes with Moffat. I think, to a certain extent, it maybe the lack of it invites fans to kind of really use their imaginations and sort of make some strange accusations. But on the whole, I think if anything, if there's a vitriolic culture of responses towards TV and media and stuff, it's probably not ameliorated that much by behind the scenes stuff. I think it is more about just the way people are encouraged to engage with stuff, the way like social platforms kind of work, and just the way in which consumers are positioned in terms of their relationship to the thing they're consuming. So I think there's a limit to how much behind the scenes stuff could really help.
Yeah, Milky Boy, I think this is a super interesting topic. So Milky Boy asks, do you think having more easily accessible behind the scenes material eases harsh criticism? I think it can do the opposite because it kind of lifts the veil. I think Gig is kind of touching it vapid. Vapidity can kind of be seen through certain material. We were talking about how much we engaged with the 2018 promotional run for Series 11 before it began, and that kind of did the opposite of endear us to the era.
Another example would be the 15-minute long Flux explanation that we talked about a while ago.
I also think there can be perception. Look at how David Lynch just doesn't address stuff. And I know some people see that as arrogant, but I think they might see it as more arrogant if David Lynch made a video saying, you don't understand Inland Highway. This is what I was saying. This was that illusion. This meant that. This meant that. You were too stupid to get it. I think that would be seen as more arrogant. And sometimes creators kind of do something like that. Not Chibnall, like it doesn't really happen in Doctor Who, but that sometimes happens. I also think behind the scenes material can shed light on production issues, sometimes directly and sometimes through what Narjawin mentioned earlier, the kind of conspicuous absence. Sometimes something is so glossy that you go, what is going on here? Like the Star Wars prequel films, especially The Phantom Menace, have quite open behind the scenes material. Like it shows things that weren't going great during the processes of making that film. It's pretty open with how it depicts a lot of George Lucas, and who he was working with and everything. And then the sequel films are much more corporate Disney, everyone's happy and everyone loves everyone kind of special features, the ones that I've seen anyway. And I think that you kind of know that every film is going to have good days and bad days. And so I think it can invite you're showing us all the good days, what were the bad days kinds of things, where the absence of it kind of frustrates you. And I also think just the more you see of a creator, like I know there was a film called The Director and the Jedi, which was a kind of making of-ish film about The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson's Star Wars film, focusing on like Rian Johnson making the movie. And that film was like kindling for the people who really strongly dislike Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi, because it had so many things in it where if that film didn't exist, there'll be no gif of Rian Johnson jumping on a bouncy castle while kids aren't on the bouncy castle or something. That gif exists because of this behind-the-scenes material for the film exists. There's a lot of psychoanalysis of Rian Johnson because of that film. There's stuff where he talks about the inspiration behind certain characters and costumes and things, which I see a lot of people psychoanalyze really hardcore, and that became a big part of how they saw Rian Johnson and what he was trying to do. If that film didn't exist, there would be much less of that, or it would be much more kind of vaporous, people just making stuff up. But because it does exist, people can psychoanalyze him more and feel more strongly about him, and there's more stuff to talk about. You know what I mean? So I think more behind the scenes material can actually not endear you also to some people. It can give you more material to dislike someone with.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? And on that topic of conspicuous absences that you mentioned, I mean, we've got a perfect example, the 11-minute silence on the Spyfall 2 commentary.
Yeah. Milky Boy goes on to say, I find that even if I don't like something, hearing the justifications by the creators and seeing how much work goes into each production makes me appreciate it existing more.
See, I would say not all... I think sometimes when you see the justifications from the creators and then you see the amount of work going into something, if there's a disparity there, then what you might have is lots of people putting loads and loads of work into something that the creatives, like the leaders, maybe aren't thinking about that well. So maybe you've got a showrunner saying, themes are for 8th grade book reports, or you've got and then on that show you have loads of people working away trying to make the best show they can, but they ultimately can't because the material they're being given maybe isn't that good. Then that's gonna, obviously you might appreciate the people working on like the sets or the costumes and the CGI or stuff, but that might make you not appreciate so much their bosses, basically. So it's not completely equal on every level, is what I would say to that.
I did see the season 1 finale of the Wheel of Time TV show, a lot of people didn't like. And I did see some people pull back and go, well, all right, after they kind of read stuff from the showrunner and different people working on the show, cast and crew, about the COVID complications and other casting complications that were going into some issues behind that episode and why it ended up the way it did. I did actually see some people cool off and go, well, I didn't like the episode, but I don't feel like at the show anymore. And I feel like, well, let's see what they do next season. So that's kind of what Milky Boy is talking about, I guess, that there is an element of sometimes you go, well, okay, we're in the real world. I get it. So I'm going to pull back a little from the criticism. So I do see that happen sometimes. But like Gig says, sometimes you are like, well, clearly some people put huge amounts of work into this. Maybe the costume makers, or sometimes the actors or the composer or whatever, and maybe there's a disconnect. Maybe the showrunner or the writers or some producers didn't put as much work into it. And that maybe makes you dislike the show, or at least the showrunner, more, because you're like, well, they let down, certain other hard workers by not, putting the script in on time or something. So I think that can go a couple of different ways, what Milky Boy's talking about there. Milky Boy continues, I think there's some incredibly harsh and dodgy criticism towards a lot of nerd media at the moment, primarily because behind the scenes media seems to be less accessible. People can project their own biases on the shows or dehumanize the shows because they aren't seeing everything that goes into it.
I might mildly disagree with that. I think people projecting biases onto a show and dehumanizing kind of people behind the show is sort of, I think people are going to do that, then seeing more of the people they're dehumanizing won't necessarily stop them doing it. I think it's just actually, it gives them more to project onto and more to dehumanize almost. I think, like you just described with the like gifs of Rian Johnson and stuff, I think if you give people material, then anyone who's in the mindset to go in like hating this might probably just like keep hating. I think people say, if you've got people who have a whole YouTube channel where their grift is to rant about how the woke has destroyed Doctor Who or whatever, saying shit like that, then they're not just gonna stop because Moff came out and said, hey, I'm not woke. That's not gonna matter. So I think stuff like that is more down to the underlying relationships between like the fans and the show than necessarily how much we can see or how much evidence we have about what's happening.
Yeah, I also, behind the scenes media being less accessible, I'm of two minds there. On the one hand, totally, because home media releases, especially in the heyday of DVDs, got so much behind the scenes material. Streaming days, it's pretty rare. Some shows do get behind the scenes stuff. The Wheel of Time had a bizarre amount. It got so much behind the scenes material. It was weird in a good way. It was just like a flood of it every week. So many videos and all sorts of web content. And on Disney Plus, some stuff like The Mandalorian, I kind of enjoyed the behind the scenes videos of the first season more than the actual show, because I was just really interested in the craft of how they were making the show and everything. I found that a bit more interesting than the Grogu and the Mandalorian's adventures. But they're kind of the exceptions, aren't they? The Mandalorian, Wheel of Time.
HBO did a documentary about House of the Dragon, didn't they? Like the house that dragons built or something like that.
Yeah, they're about 20-minute long, The House That Dragons Built episodes. Yeah, I guess maybe it's changing now, but certainly previously, like, streaming stuff got nothing. It got no special features at all, no commentaries, no little videos. That's started to change a bit now, I suppose, as of last year at least, but which is great. But so I can see behind the scenes media less accessible in that sense, like Doctor Who downsized, that sort of thing. There's a kind of rise in podcasts that sometimes creators of a show do, like Craig Mazin for The Last of Us and Chernobyl did like these official podcasts. Lindelof Watchmen got a few of those. Sometimes, though, these happen and there's no one actually making the show on them. The House of the Dragon got one, and it was just people. It wasn't the showrunners. It was just like other people that didn't make the show were doing the official podcast. So I found that sort of strange. But those can be cool. Those official podcasts some shows get now. But yeah, I guess it kind of, I think generally this sort of thing will just confirm your biases. It's going to make you like someone more if you already like them. It's going to make you dislike someone more if you already dislike them. Maybe there's something to be said for creatives that are very absent. Like at the top of this, I said some of my favorite directors, and one of those is Terrence Malick, who is like, there are very few photographs of him and he doesn't really do interviews and he hates kind of being in the media. And so he's very absent. His films are extremely personal, so people like feel like they know him. But as a man and as a director, he's very absent in terms of press and interviews and whatnot. And so I feel like he's kind of stalled off certain visions of him that people might have invented, maybe even accurately, if he was more present, if that makes sense. So there's something to be said for absence, I suppose. Milky Boy ends with, there are a lot of Doctor Who episodes that I think are a bit naff, but hearing the enthusiasm of the creators, set designers, costume designers, directors, and actors makes it so hard for me to hate it. I certainly would never direct hate at the people involved, and yet some people do.
I think the act of directing hate, let's say, sending hate mail to like Mandip Gill or something, which people have done, I think it is just, I think to even get to that point, I think as a human being,
yeah,
I think it's more related to these people's conditions as a human being, the way they have become, like in this society, in just everything. I think it is way more. I don't think it's the kind of thing you can just solve by being a bit more open and friendly with like behind the scenes stuff. I feel that it's something so fundamentally irrational and strange and awful and weird. The idea that it's just fine to behave like that. I think it's just so much more based on the underlying structures that it's just not the sort of thing that like Doctor Who could solve just by changing how they distribute stuff. I think it goes much deeper, and I think it transcends just like media. I think it's to do with the whole way people relate to each other. I think.
Yeah, it's some weird alienation, just cruelty, strange thing. Like I said earlier that it was very flattering when Robert Sheeman commented a nice thing on our Chimes of Midnight review, but it's also kind of like I think someone commented on something a while ago saying, "Oh, it would be so cool if you interviewed Chris Chibnall." No way. No. If I ever met the man, I would be extremely polite to him and I'd just have a positive, quick, interaction. I don't want to meet him. It's like, that Community episode where Troy, he's arranged to meet his like hero, LeVar Burton, and he's extremely stressed out about it because he says something like, "You can't disappoint a pitcher." He never wanted to actually meet his hero. I'm not saying Chibnall is my hero. I'm just saying you kind of want a distance with people. At least I do. I
think existing in a bubble is kind of not bubble, but like having a bit of an insulation between you and the people whose work you're like criticizing and analyzing is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
I think you shouldn't feel like constrained by not wanting to like disappoint them or like hurt their feelings or too much or whatever. I think it doesn't need to be that personal.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is a thing. You don't want to have too much over integration there. Regarding the issue of hating stuff, which Milky Boy brings up, the idea of like hating an episode, I think there are some episodes I hate, but not in the sense that I hate like the people who worked on them or whatever, or I hate like stuff like that. I think it's just a sense that I hate what they're doing.
Yeah.
Like I hate kind of the ideas behind them, stuff like that, or maybe how they're executed. It's not that personal of a thing. because we are just talking about a finished product at the end of the day.
I also feel like there's a weird element where I think there's a very natural equilibrium, which is like the creators make something and the fans and critics, critique and talk about it, and never the two shall meet is kind of the way I think it doesn't have to work that way, but I think that's sort of the way it should generally kind of work. I think it's very weird when like someone seeks out reviews and they find negative ones and then they confront the reviewers who weren't trying to send it to them at all, which we know happens in the Doctor Who sphere with some people. And it's like, I find that really uncomfortable because there's a huge power differential there. It's very, very strange. And it's just extremely ugly, I think, to do that. And so like, obviously there are some people who in a gross way, they go and direct their hate and they like tweet it, Mandy Buell, whatever, saying you suck. And that's absolutely, for one, she doesn't suck. She's great. And for two, that's an extremely insane, awful thing to do. Why are you doing that? But then there's also the situation where if like someone's saying, so-and-so, you're writing, but if someone is just, doing a blog saying so-and-so's writing is bad because blah, blah, blah. And then if the writer of that is like name searching and then they find that post and they go, and they tweet about, well, I'd like to see you try better. You're being an insane person there. Like they were doing the right normal thing. They consumed your product and they were talking about it. If anything, they were actually helping you, to be honest, because by virtue of talking about it, they were signal boosting you. They were helping you, to be honest, if you think about it. But even that's like really, really twisted, which is something that sometimes happens and I find really gross. And I also think this ties back into when we were talking about never monetizing anything ever. I think it's a similar thing of I don't want to ever talk to Chibnall. And you just want the distance to just be able to talk how you want to talk, basically, without it being weird.
Yeah.
There are a very small group of people that I would be interested if I could talking to, but it's not Chibnall. Because that would just not work. Zach Inc. on YouTube, Zach is back. Zach says, how would you see a turned left-esque episode panning out for other Doctors? What if Rose had never met 9, or if Clara had abandoned the Doctor after they regenerated from 11 to 12?
This may be a slightly hot take here, but I think if 9 hadn't met Rose, he'd have ended up meeting someone else possibly very similar, because I think he was putting himself in the kind of situation where he would meet people inherently. I don't really believe in companion exceptionalism, as you might call it. I think the idea that, say, Rose was the only person that the Doctor could possibly have met at that point who had the exact right qualities to lift 9 out of his funk. I don't think it quite works like that. I think it's more that it's something that happened organically. I think it's more about Rose's circumstances that put her where she is. You see what I'm talking about here. So I say, so this is not me. I'm not talking down Rose, I'm not downplaying Rose at all saying this. I'm just saying that, there are some cases where I think, the companion doesn't have to be the only one of their kind to be important, if you see what I mean. In terms of it might even be the same situation for
It's very unromantic of you.
So it might even be the similar situation for 11 and Victoria and Clara, honestly, because because he was in the whole thing and she was there to sort of lift him out of it, but it's not like she was the only plucky Victorian woman in existence, So I think Donna's circumstances are a bit special.
Yes.
In that her very first encounter with the Doctor is one where she basically sort of saves him from doing something overtly mad and kind of suicidal almost. And that's in her very first encounter with him, before she even becomes a companion. So I think that's why the premise for Turn Left sort of organically emerges, this idea of if that didn't happen, then the Doctor would fucking die or something, and everything would go to shit. I think in terms of finding the equivalent for other Doctors, I guess it has to be something where, it has to be companion focused, obviously. I think 12 would not respond well to being dumped by Clara at all. I think he might spiral a bit if that happened, given how devoted he ends up being to her. But I'm not sure if it's that easy to come up with other counterfactuals. I know a while ago, quite a long while ago, there was this comic by Paul Cornell. I think it was one of those random multi-Doctor ones that they do. I think it was by Paul Cornell. And it sort of does a whistle-stop tour of these alternative scenarios, these dark scenarios for Doctors, where what if this episode had gone wrong? And one of them was what if 11 chose to stay in the bubble universe with River in the Wedding of River song and not break out of it? And sort of the whole universe goes to shit in this little bubble reality. He was kind of coming up with alternative counterfactuals for those. Those are kind of interesting. That's kind of all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree with the point that Turn Left is actually pretty connected to The Runaway Bride in a fairly specific way in terms of how everything goes wrong there and how it actually does relate to Donna. But I get the general question Zach is asking. Yeah, it would be fun to do all sorts of like tragic tours through Doctor histories in inverted ways like that. Yeah, that would be interesting.
I would say one more thing about that is that you'd have to be careful not to just do what if the Doctor died and everything was doomed because the Doctor is the most important person in the... I think, that's... Obviously, that's, turn left, it's fine to do that in that episode. But I feel repeating it over and over and over, you need a different idea, right? Something else.
Also, if you want a ninth Doctor who never met Rose and who got really gentrified and his accent classed up for some reason, that is available to you. You can go purchase that for rather a lot of money.
Yeah.
It is right there. Zach also says, if budget was no issue and you were asked to make a Doctor Who video game where anything goes, what would you make? What genre would it be? Who would you play as?
I thought about that one a little bit. I think it would be... I'd want it to be a sort of a dialogue choice-driven RPG sort of thing. And I think I'd want to play as someone who meets a specific Doctor and companion on an adventure. So I want it to be a specific story set in a specific era. Because I think a lot of people's ideas for Doctor Who games are just trying to incorporate the whole totality of Doctor Who, and you can go through all the worlds and meet all the monsters and do all this. I think I'd want to see something that actually focuses on a specific lead writer's interpretation and vision and identity to be brought out in that story. Because I think that's how the best Doctor Who stories kind of tend to bubble up. So I'd want something like that. Specific Doctor, specific companion, specific individual adventure, individual story. And sometimes in Doctor Who, the Doctor will trust someone who's not a companion to make a choice or do the right thing. And I want the player to be put in that role. So you'd have different outcomes reflecting whatever your personal takeaway from the world and themes were. And I think that's how I'd want your choices to kind of affect the ending of the story or the outcome or who lives and dies and stuff like that. So I think a game like that would be cool and kind of in the vein of what I like about Who.
Here's my $1 billion idea. Hogwarts Legacy in Gallifrey, you play as the Decker.
Make $1 billion, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, it's a huge question. I guess I would just want some sort of game I would like. So maybe a isometric CRPG or maybe like a third person RPG and like, I don't know. I agree with Gig. It should be like a kind of small focused slice of something. Where's a cool setting that Doctor Who has that's not Gallifrey and not Peladon?
Caldor City? No, not...
I mean, it's kind of derivative, but yeah, that's a pretty developed setting. You could do a kind of noir RPG on Caldor City. That's not a bad idea, actually. That could actually be pretty good.
The faction homeworld? The 11-Day Empire? Or something like that?
I know what. The City of the Saved. The City of the Saved.
Oh, yeah.
Do like a mystery kind of RPG or do an immersive sim in the City of the Saved. That would be extremely interesting. Yeah, that's my idea. Caldor City or City of the Saved.
If you wanted to pander to RTD nostalgia, you could do New Earth, maybe get the cat people in, something like that. Any setting that's had, I guess, any sort of fleshing out of it done is somewhere you could put something, even if it wasn't that interesting. Honestly, to be honest, you could also just come up with a new setting, one that's specific to the story you want to tell. That might be the best approach.
I'm not sure New Who there's not actually that many like super developed settings. But then again, does Classic Who have that many? There's Peladon and there's Caldor City.
Yeah, in terms of developed settings, I'd say like the TV show is kind of slight on those. Maybe the stuff outside the show is maybe more like that.
The expanded universe does a pretty good job of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Going on YouTube, Bowl of Petunias says, the streaming TV industry seems to be going through its big crunch moment at the precise moment Doctor Who is broken into it. Virtually finished projects are getting written off for tax breaks, greenlit projects, even from big names, are being quietly dropped, and streamers are becoming far more conservative in their spending and consolidating their efforts on their biggest, zeitgeistiest hits. The juggernaut of Marvel even finds itself curtailing its output. Especially notable is Star Trek, the tentpole of Paramount's streaming service, and the very franchise RTD has modelled his year-round Empire model of Doctor Who on, has had its flagship show, Discovery, cancelled, and is having to do reshoots months after wrapping filming to make the finale work as an ending. I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Me neither.
Petunias goes on to say, where does an expanding Doctor Who fit into a contracting industry? That's well phrased, Petunia. They go on, does the main show have enough global appeal to be worth the not insignificant funding Disney is providing for more than a couple of years? particularly when this is content that Disney won't exclusively own. What happens if this deal isn't as fruitful as it was promised to be, especially with the BBC in such a precarious position? Great question, Bowl of Petunias. Gig, what do you think?
I would say, in general, even if they often can't avoid it, I would say corporations generally don't want to look like their strategies are hideous failures. So I can see the whole Doctor Who thing sticking for a while out of sheer stubbornness, if nothing else. I think the thing to watch for will be whether the supposed spin-offs, whether they have legs, or if they get crunched back to just the main show, like after like one series or two series. Regarding whether it has global appeal, I think it probably has enough, like to sustain itself, to exist. I think the relationships in terms of like the BBC as a like producer of drama are probably something that like Disney might want to at least have some sort of access to. I don't think the House of Cards is gonna like topple over just from a breeze, basically. I think even if it doesn't go exactly to plan, I don't think we're in like an immediate crisis situation. But I do think we might end up seeing plans realised that aren't quite as vast as maybe the ones being mulled over initially. What do you think, Neo?
Yeah, I think there'll be at least a while where things are tolerated as an experiment to see what happens. I think early on. We're aware that the show is in a curious little state right now, and this is a very new model it's going into. So I don't think if Shooty's first series has lower numbers than Disney and Russell are expecting, I don't think it's going to be a huge crisis, cancel everything right away. But if it continues that way, like, who knows what's going to happen. Yeah, that'll be very interesting to see. It will be very interesting if this falls flat on its face, like Petunias has proposed. If it does not work when they're putting all this into it, that would be very interesting to see. Maybe it does contract as a show again. And hey, it's not necessarily like... A lot of people treat this RTD vision of we're going to have loads of spin-offs and it's going to be year-round and we're going to be doing so much Who, falling out years. A lot of people just take that as inherently good and what everyone should want. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Like, you don't need to want that to be a Doctor Who fan. It's okay to not want all that. It doesn't make you a bad fan to not want year-round Who and year-round spin-offs. You don't need to want that. So if that all fails, that's not necessarily like the worst thing ever.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the end of Doctor Who itself or the end of the BBC if this one thing falls through. There are other aspects to the whole situation. Obviously, regarding the BBC's precarity, I think it's less to do with like an individual drama kind of propping it up, and it's just more to do with, I think, the whole situation in the UK, and I think just the nature of everything falling apart and being attacked from all sides by just in the most insane people in the world. I think there's a limit to how much Doctor Who can really affect that.
This also connects to things like how much VFX Doctor Who is going to need and budget issues and stuff, which are a huge deal with Marvel and Star Trek and VFX bottlenecks. I don't know like how... It probably will be very VFX heavy, more so than the last era, I assume, because it's trying to be up and beyond. But, you know, there's ways Doctor Who doesn't necessarily have to be the same as other big genre shows like that. It could be done theoretically. Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because they all want parody with this super expensive stuff. That's what everyone's tried to do, Moffat and Russell and Chibnall, and it's tough. But I guess there's more money now, so we'll see. I think it could have enough global appeal under Russell to work pretty well, though. Yeah,
I think. Yeah, I'm not anticipating it to be like a mess. I mean, you know, it's had distribution deals overseas like for ages. Like that's not some new, bizarre, unfamiliar concept. So I think people seem to like it enough, and it's been like a consistent brand, a consistent thing. Like there's, even if it's gone sort of wobbly with Chibnall, there's an element of reliability to it in terms of getting it made and having a base of people who will engage with it no matter what. And that's probably seen as an asset for Disney. You know, that's probably why they want it. And that's not all gonna disappear in like 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's very speculative. We'll see, Petunias. We're both going to be paying attention. Our last question is an email from Kevin Johnson, who says, "What's the one thing you'd like all your viewers to know or consider?" Thanks, Kevin.
Well, shout out to Kevin, because he's a frequent commenter on my blog and he's emailed me some really lovely stuff. He's a cool guy. I would say my answer to that question is to consider everything you've accepted as normal since you were immersed in it as a child, and now consider how much of it is probably just bullshit designed to convince you that nothing can ever be made better. I'd like you to consider that, basically. Just keep that in your mind.
When we started recording these Q&A answers, it was around April 1st, or very early April. So my answer's a little bit outdated now, but it would be to treat every day like it's April Fool's Day. You know how people get skeptical of news and narratives on April Fool's Day? That's lovely. And you're never a bigger fool than when you're forming these enormous opinions, or you're making these huge declarations, or doing things like grandly hating something or somewhere that you have very little context of or frame of reference for to understand at all, really.
Yeah.
So let's treat every day like it's April Fool's Day.
And you'll be smiling a lot more, because that's what April Fool's Day is for. Yeah.
That's my suggestion. Thank you, Kevin.
Oh, and that's the end.
Yeah, that sums it up. What did you think of all that, Gig?
I had a lot of fun. I think it's really nice to to obviously go on rants and share some of our feelings and opinions and stuff, but it's nice to just engage with what the people who watch us are thinking and wondering. It's nice to hash out some stuff regarding what's going on behind the scenes, what our ideas are, like thoughts, hopes for the future, and sort of maybe even develop some new ideas for stuff we can potentially do. I loved hearing that you are open to doing another Choose Your Own Adventure game. That's really cool. Yeah, this has been really fun.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for the questions and for following the channel. I hope it's clear that we take people listening to us seriously. That's hence my fussiness and fastidiousness with some things, because I want to repay back that respect. That's, you take us seriously, I take you seriously. That's how this all works. So I really do appreciate it. I know it's a lot to listen to, so it means a lot. And we're not going anywhere. There's so much more in the works, as you've heard, so let's keep forging ahead.
Woohoo!
The fun can continue because we do have a few stragglers, a small amount of questions left that peeped up over time since the second discussion came out. So let's go quickly over those. So the first is an email from P. It kind of reminds me of O and the spy way of referring to oneself. Anyway, P says, "Hi Neo, love the pod, best regular Doctor Who analysis around. If I'm not too late for the Q&A, you and in Giga resisted a question along these lines in part 1, if I remember correctly. So you may just not be interested in this kind of question at all. What would you or any other guests do as showrunner / what does your dream series of Doctor Who look like in terms of tone, casting, format, etc.?
Well, again, while I don't really see myself as a showrunner at all, I have no idea what I do as showrunner, but certainly we all have perfect idealised fantasies and dreams of if you could magic up your own Doctor Who, what would it be like? And tone-wise, I think something like The Girl Who Dies is a pretty good ballpark, because I like that mix of serious, metaphorical, and utter whimsy and absurdity, and maybe with a bit of listen thrown in there, and presumably something else not by Moffat or at all. But yeah, I think I like that kind of general ghoulishness, but with a healthy dose of absurdity in there. I think that's kind of where I like my Doctor Who to be pitched, more or less. I don't have like fan casts or anything in general.
Yeah.
But I would say one actor who I'd love to see in Doctor Who in any capacity is Ruth Wilson. Because if you've ever seen her in anything, you'll know she's just great, isn't she?
Yeah. Something I'd like if I was producing or doing something with the show is it's not that I want it super serialized. Like, I'm not a huge person like who's like, oh, Flux or whatever is being super serialized. This is incredible. I can take or leave that. The anthological nature is actually something I love loads about the show. But I would like if like some series could be like, for this series, we're going to really be focused on kind of pastiching or doing something with this genre. And then that's it. We won't do that next series. And that's kind of over. I think that would be a fun thing to do. Like, what if for one series, the show cycled through like a bunch of different types of science fiction, like in order of like how those science fiction subgenres came out? Or like, what if one series decided, let's do a bunch of fantasy stuff? Like, we're going to specifically try and do a bunch of fantasy pastiches or homages or something. I think that would be a fun thing to do, is kind of go more specific on genre, like related to one series. That's my only big producer kind of idea in my head right now.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. I think conceits like that, there's a lot of room to explore with those. There's a lot to be said for exploring an idea over a whole series, like several episodes. And that's not really done very often in Who, is it? I mean, you're not necessarily doing just one setting or one story for the whole season, but actually exploring the idea through each of the stories that you do in another way. There are some thematic approaches to that the show has maybe taken. Like Series 8 does a lot with the idea of soldiers and stuff. But I would say in terms of actually more explicitly, more big kind of headline way, I think hasn't quite been done. Something like you're describing would be quite cool.
It doesn't need to be plot connected either. It can just be like I think it would be cool if like there was a premiere that was maybe something really ancient or maybe something kind of Frankenstein-y, and it's kind of riffing on that as like a kind of first science fiction thing. And then maybe the episode 2 is a Jules Verne type thing. And then episode 3 is a H.G. Wellsy type thing. And, eventually you get to the 80s and do a cyberpunky thing. You get further on, you do whatever sci-fi does now. I just think that would be a cool thing to do one day. But yeah. Another email we got also by a one-letter person. What's with all this spy stuff? We're getting P, we're getting M. M here, we've already answered one of their questions in discussion 2 with Oliver, which was the Treehouse Simpsons anthology type 1. But their other question here, we've also kind of answered, but I just thought I should read it out since they did send it in. It's for Neo and Giga. Have you ever considered doing a podcast with a larger ensemble cast like the earlier podcasts, or are you content with the current format of having a smaller group?
Never again. I think if you experience it, if you've ever edited a podcast with 8 people, you'll understand. Trust me,
Yeah.
it's such a pain in the ass. Yeah, I think probably our limit is 4 for the time being.
Yes.
Maybe if some extremely special occasion, I think we've been pushed to doing like 5, but I think 4 is the logical limit, I think, that we have arrived at.
Yes, definitely. Another question from Twitter, from the lovely Mark Clapham, is late question for the panel, if you can squeeze it in. For older fans, particularly in the UK, Doctor Who is the first thing you became a fan of as a small child. Was Doctor Who the first thing you were a fan of? And if not, what was?
To be honest, even though I wasn't exactly a small child when I became a fan of Doctor Who, I still think it's probably the first time the concept of being a fan or something, or in fandom of something, was wired into my brain, really. And there was other stuff like I consumed, I guess, before that point, but not with any sort of commitment, really. Not to the point where I'd watch old episodes and DVDs and stuff. It's certainly where TV is concerned. So yeah, I'd say Doctor Who probably is my first fandom, which is kind of weird to think about, but yeah, no, it's nonetheless, that's probably the case. What about you, Neo?
Yes, it depends what you call a fandom. Like I was, if by that we just mean like into a pretty set IP, I guess I was into Tolkien stuff like beforehand. I got into that a bit younger than I did with Doctor Who. So I guess that's my answer. But I was pretty young when I got seriously into Doctor Who. I asked around a few other people just to see if we could get any other answers. From Tyler, who's younger than us, but he is British, he did say Doctor Who 2005, and he was interested in the first place because he'd seen the Daleks, the Hartnell story, in late 2004, which made young 4-year-old Tyler feel a certain adrenaline cocktail of fear and intrigue and aesthetic satisfaction he's chased from Doctor Who ever since. It's a beautiful thing he's grateful for because nothing has matched up to that feeling of being a child in the dark watching black and white TARDIS and Daleks and weird, abrasive, enigmatic Hartnell. That's not just me waxing lyrically about Tyler's, that's his own words he sent me. I'm quoting there.
It's a great response.
We had a few other people just say the same sort of thing. It was Doctor Who for a lot of Brits. Our friend Mira's from the USA had Star Wars and Jurassic Park. And he's older than us, so that's the oldest opinion we could get.
Would you say Star Wars is sort of embedded in America the way Doctor Who is over here, or maybe not quite the same?
I don't know, because I'm not from either place.
Yeah, so neither of us are from America. We can't comment, can we?
Star Wars seems very baked into the American cultural consciousness. You can see that. Look at how The Force Awakens did in America compared to the rest of the world. So maybe, yeah. That's pretty much it for straggling questions. There is a straggling point, though. I noticed checking a Q&A one discussion thing. I raised a point that I said I would come back to at the start of it, and I never came back to it. Early on in the first Q&A discussion, I talked about... in that discussion, I talked a lot about the debates were the thing I'm happiest with on the channel, or the thing I liked the most. But I also mentioned there was something I think didn't work with the audience the right way. My fault. It's not the audience's fault, of course. It can't be the audience's fault. It's my issue there, which was the debates. I just never got around to actually making that point. Was there any disconnect, do you think, between how I conceived those and how those got received?
I think it's kind of always a difficult sell in some ways when you have people quite formalistically giving sort of pre-written sort of speeches about, even if it's viewpoints I might not necessarily agree with. I think maybe part of the way that the format was less organic conversation between people and more like, okay, present your thing. Maybe it was too formal is the wrong word, but it's sort of regimented for some people. I don't know. Or it could be that maybe like the questions that kind of we were pursuing in those debates maybe weren't like catching on with audiences or something. I don't know. I had fun in the one that I was involved with. I had fun doing it. But sure, I mean, maybe it is like maybe the premise isn't quite that accessible. Maybe it could be something more like hooked into current issues or something. Maybe a debate about RTD2 might do more, might get people's interest more. I don't know, compared to like esoteric Dalek arguments and stuff.
It's not so much the interest. I feel like culturally debates, like that's a thing in schools in Australia, and from my understanding of like American pop culture, it's something over there. I don't know if it is in the UK so much, but the idea of like you get assigned arbitrarily a debate position. You will often not get the one you agree with, but then it's your job to argue it properly. And you can argue it, in different ways. You can argue a way where it's like you personally do kind of agree with, or you can argue in a way where it's very much about the rhetoric. But that's like a thing that's always swam around me. Like I'm very aware of that format. And I think maybe I was resting on that a bit too much because some people seemed irritated by the questions and like the idea of what we were doing, like in the debrief suddenly we dropped character. It's like I feel like that didn't connect with everyone the way. Maybe I was just assuming a kind of understanding of the sort of thing I was doing there. Maybe that was my fault. I don't know.
Maybe people feel a bit like disconnected, like when they know that they're listening to someone who is just sort of doing a rhetorical trick rather than actually espousing viewpoints they sincerely like are kind of curious about and sort of trying to present seriously. I think maybe they feel that their time is being wasted a little bit because they even though obviously by clicking on the video they nonetheless sort of agreed to listen to this debate thing. Maybe they feel they didn't get what they signed up for because maybe they're actually. I think maybe the disconnectedness of it, like the way in which the participants are kind of removed from their argument somewhat, sort of dulls the excitement for some people. Maybe it's something like that.
I feel like if we were doing a debate on whether like Rand Score or Parting of the Ways was better, and we went out and we found someone and we made friends with someone, we made it all work, that we got someone on who absolutely believed Rand Score was much better than Parting, and who was a huge fan of the whole approach to the show in Series 11 and onward with the Chibnall and everything. If we got someone on like that, I feel like that's...
Do you feel like it's unfair, sort of? Because it's sort of having someone who is almost like a token dissenter versus the prevailing opinions of the channel, like yours and myself.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of... It gives me a weird circus vibe. Like, I wouldn't feel... Unless we were... I just feel like that would be weirder and kind of gross in some way. Like there's lots of people like that I would be happy to talk to and make friends with, but I feel like seeking someone out for, I want to buddy you up so I can have you argue a position I think is silly because I want to argue with you on my channel. I feel like it's really weird. I feel like this kind of safe space of, I don't think Rand Score is better, but I'm not taking the piss. I'm going to actually try and construct an argument I think I can have a decent go at beating Gig with or beating Tomtit with. I'm going to try and make a really strong argument for it. Like, I feel like that's less of a joke, but maybe people disagree with me. But the fact that I, like, in my heart of hearts, think Parting is better than Rand Score doesn't mean I can't make a great argument for I haven't. But it doesn't mean I couldn't develop a great argument for Rand Score being better. That's part of, like, how all this stuff works, I think, is that, rhetorically, you can argue positions you don't actually agree with without being, like, gross about them or, like, without backhandedly insulting them. Not saying we'd never do that in a debate. like you can see in the Chibnall Dalek one, there were some positions there I thought were actually strong, some of the political ones, and there were some which were a bit more of a rhetorical trick. But I don't know. Any thoughts on what I'm throwing around?
I think when you're trying to come up with arguments for stuff that you think kind of doesn't really necessarily hold water, I think the arguments can, even though they are sort of built up with a lot of rhetorical strength or pulling from lots of different things, they might inherently feel like reaches. And I think that sense of something being a reach, you can never quite escape it. Like even if you're like putting all your effort into sort of make it sound as convincing as possible, I think the audience will kind of know that you are reaching to kind of make something up, rather than arguing that from a place of honest to God thinking this makes sense and is reasonable. I think it's always going to be a bit difficult, I think. I will say though, just one more thing. I think when you look at just relating to that whole thing about how you don't want to get people on just to bully them, basically, I think when you look at how like so many, I guess, YouTube channels and entertainers and people like that, online figures, kind of do that whole debate bro shit where they get someone in, maybe they get some Nazi in, or maybe the inverse, maybe some Nazi gets like a communist in, and just to have just to basically have this carnivalesque kind of clash of freak show sort of entertainment, infotainment sort of thing. And I think how that's kind of reprehensible, I think, in some ways. I think there's something to respect about not wanting to do anything like that, just conducting it between yourselves rather than having someone in just to poke at. I think it shows you're taking the idea seriously, at least, if you try to put yourself in those shoes.
Maybe it's the word debate is giving the wrong impression, since that's so tied up in what you're talking about. Like I think that's gross, the kind of carnival circusy approach to debating, and I think it's very poisonous actually in a lot of ways. But like I feel like how we do it is more of like a game show thing, or it's like a game kind of taking on different positions and, swirling them around and everything. I feel like that's a much warmer, nicer, not confrontational in that kind of way sort of thing. They're not ended. Like I will do more eventually. I know Oliver would like to do one with us at some point. So that'll definitely happen. But I am wondering about tweaking the format in some ways. I actually had a exchange with someone a while ago over tweaking the cloister bell noise we have in them because of oral processing issues and whatnot. So that's at least one thing that'll be changing. But if listeners have any thoughts on all that stuff as well, the debates will definitely come back at some point. But if you have any thoughts on the stuff we're throwing around there, I'd love to hear. Since I feel like when people are commenting and they just seem like irritated by the title, or they seem confused by what we're doing, like clearly there's something I'm doing that's not working right. In some regard with that. Like the debates are the thing I'm happiest with and proudest with on the channel. So, but also they're not working with everyone the way I think like the podcasts tend to. Everyone who listens to them seems to kind of get what we're doing with there. So yeah.
I think that point about them being like a game show is quite a good one, because that is how they work, isn't it? Because you've got the time limit and everything, and that's I think how we approach them going into them. So I think maybe if you were to like rebrand them or something, like something emphasising the warm, friendly game show like nature of it might be like a path to explore.
Yeah, and I think that's it really. Yeah, I think that's all the points I had left hanging. So to reiterate the earlier ending we recorded before these last little extra questions we added. This was great. Thank you so much for sending stuff in. A lot of fun to answer them. Keep letting us know what you think. This isn't the end of ever asking us questions or anything. But yeah, thanks a lot for celebrating these milestones with us.
Yeah, thank you. And see you next time on Who Cares?